Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody tells you how loud silence can be, until you find yourself surrounded by nothing but frozen emptiness. My name is irrelevant now, but what happened to me in March 2018 changed everything about how I understand survival, fear, and the absolute indifference of nature. At 34, fresh off a divorce that had gutted my savings and my sense of self, I had taken a contract job with a telecommunications company installing satellite equipment in remote Alaskan villages. The pay was exceptional, the kind of money that made you overlook the fact that you would be flying in tiny aircraft over landscapes that looked like they belonged on another planet. I had grown up in suburban Minnesota, spent my 20s chasing a career in network engineering, and somehow ended up agreeing to spend 6 weeks bouncing between communities that most Americans could not find on a map. The irony of running away from one kind of isolation straight into another was not lost on me. But desperation makes you brave in stupid ways. The morning of the crash started like any other workday in that strange chapter of my life. I woke up at 5 in the morning in a small motel in Bethel, a hub town in southwestern Alaska that served as my base of operations. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and frost had crystallized on the inside of the single window, despite the heater running all night. My pilot for the day was a guy named Dean Archer, a wiry man in his early 50s with sun-damaged skin and the kind of calm demeanor that either meant he was incredibly competent or completely checked out. He had been flying bush routes for over 2 decades, and when I met him at the airstrip that morning, he was already doing his pre-flight check on a Cessna 185 that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was faded, patches of primer showing through in spots, but Dean assured me she was mechanically sound. We were headed to a village called Akiak, about 40 miles northeast, then continuing to 2 other communities before looping back. The whole trip was supposed to take 6 hours, weather permitting. We took off around 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pale orange and pink. From the air, the Alaskan tundra in late winter is something that defies description. An endless white canvas broken only by dark ribbons of frozen rivers, and the occasional cluster of spruce trees that looked like black needles poking through a bedsheet. Dean was not much of a talker, which suited me fine. He communicated in short bursts, pointing out landmarks, mentioning changes in weather patterns, occasionally adjusting the radio to check in with other pilots in the area. The Cessna hummed along steadily, and despite the cramped quarters and the constant vibration that made my teeth feel loose, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the flight. We completed the first 2 stops without incident, me hauling my equipment cases through snow that came up to my knees, Dean smoking cigarettes by the plane, and chatting with locals who seemed to know him by name. By early afternoon, we were headed to our final destination before turning back, a village called Tuluksak that sat along the Kuskokwim River. That is when the engine coughed. It was a sound so subtle that I almost missed it. A brief stutter in the constant drone that had become background noise. Dean's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His hands tightened on the yoke, and his eyes flicked to the instrument panel with an intensity that had been absent all day. He did not say anything at first, just started flipping switches and adjusting controls with movements that were quick but deliberate. The engine coughed again, longer this time, and the plane shuddered in a way that made my stomach clench. We were flying over a stretch of wilderness that had no villages, no roads, nothing but white emptiness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Dean grabbed the radio and started transmitting our position, his voice steady but urgent, using terminology I did not fully understand. I remember looking out the window and seeing the shadow of our plane skating across the snow below, and thinking how small we were, how insignificant against that vast frozen landscape. The engine sputtered a 3rd time, then died completely, and the sudden silence was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Dean became a different person in those moments. The laid-back pilot who had been cracking dry jokes about moose and complaining about his ex-wife transformed into something mechanical, precise, almost robotic. He told me to tighten my seatbelt and brace for impact, his voice flat and controlled, like he was reading from a manual. The Cessna became a glider, the only sounds now the wind rushing past the fuselage and the creak of the airframe as Dean fought to maintain control. He was looking for a place to land, scanning the terrain below with desperate focus. But there was nothing. No frozen lakes flat enough, no clearings wide enough, just rolling hills of snow and clusters of willows, and the occasional boulder poking through like a gray tooth. I remember praying, something I had not done since childhood, bargaining with a God I was not sure I believed in. The ground rushed up at us with sickening speed, and Dean pulled back on the yoke, trying to flatten our descent. We clipped something, a buried log, a snowdrift, I never found out, and the plane spun violently to the left. The world became a tumbling chaos of white and gray, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. The impact itself is fragmented in my memory, broken into snapshots that do not quite connect. I remember the windshield exploding inward, a spray of glass and snow and cold air hitting my face. I remember the sensation of being thrown forward against my restraint so hard that the breath was crushed out of my lungs. I remember a sound like a giant crumpling a tin can, and then a sharp, blinding pain in my left leg that made me scream. When everything stopped moving, I was hanging sideways in my seat, the plane resting at an angle with the crumpled nose buried in a snowbank. Blood was dripping somewhere. I could hear it, a soft pattering sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. My vision swam in and out of focus, and for a long moment I just hung there, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember how to breathe. The cold was already seeping in through the shattered windshield, a cold so intense it felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. I turned my head to look at Dean, and that is when I saw that he was not moving. His body slumped forward against the yoke, a dark stain spreading across the snow beneath his door. Getting out of that seatbelt took what felt like an eternity. My fingers were already going numb, fumbling with the release mechanism while my legs screamed in protest every time I shifted my weight. When I finally got free, I half fell, half crawled toward Dean, dragging myself across the tilted cabin floor that was now slick with hydraulic fluid and melting snow. Up close, I could see the damage. A piece of the instrument panel had broken loose during impact and caught him in the chest, and there was so much blood soaking through his jacket that I knew before I even checked for a pulse. Dean Archer, who had flown these routes for 23 years, who had told me just that morning about his daughter's wedding coming up in June, was dead. I sat there in the wreckage next to his body, shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming out in ragged white clouds, and I felt something inside me threaten to crack wide open, but the cold would not let me grieve. It demanded action, demanded movement, demanded that I focus on the only thing that mattered now, not dying in this frozen nowhere alongside a man I had known for less than 8 hours. I forced myself to assess the situation with whatever clarity I could muster through the shock and the pain. My left leg was badly injured. I could see the bone pressing against the skin just below my knee, not broken through but close, the whole limb swelling rapidly and turning colors that legs should not turn. I had cuts on my face and hands from the shattered windshield, and my ribs ached in a way that suggested at least one was cracked. The plane was destroyed beyond any hope of repair, but the fuselage was mostly intact, which meant shelter of a sort. Outside, the temperature was somewhere around 15 below zero, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. In March, this far north, we only had maybe 5 hours of usable daylight left. I crawled to the back of the cabin where my equipment cases had been stored and found them scattered and broken open, satellite components and tools strewn everywhere. But underneath the wreckage, I found my backpack with a spare jacket, 2 granola bars, a thermos of coffee that was somehow still intact, and a cigarette lighter I had been carrying even though I quit smoking 3 years prior. Not much, not nearly enough, but something. The hours that followed exist in my memory as a blur of pain, cold, and desperate improvisation. I knew from the survival training the company had given us, a half-day seminar that I'd mostly slept through, that staying with the aircraft was the right call. The wreckage would be easier for search teams to spot than a single person wandering through the wilderness, and the fuselage offered at least some protection from the wind that had started to pick up, driving the temperature even lower. I used pieces of torn insulation in my spare jacket to plug the hole where the windshield had been, working with fingers that had lost most of their feeling, cursing and crying and talking to myself just to fill the terrible silence. Dean's body was still in the pilot seat, and I could not bring myself to move him, so I just tried not to look in that direction. The radio was destroyed, crushed in the impact along with most of the instrument panel. I found the emergency locator transmitter under the rear seat, but the casing was cracked, and the indicator light that should have been blinking was dark and dead. Our last known position had been transmitted before we went down, but Dean had been in the middle of giving coordinates when the engine failed. I had no idea if anyone knew where we were, or if they were even looking yet. The sun set around 6 in the evening, and the darkness that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. In Minnesota, even on the darkest winter nights, there was always some ambient light, street lamps, distant highways, the glow of civilization on the horizon. Out here, there was nothing. The blackness was so complete that I could not see my hand in front of my face, and the only sounds were the wind howling across the tundra and the occasional groan of the aircraft's twisted frame settling in the snow. I rationed the coffee, taking small sips to keep my core temperature up, and ate half of one granola bar, even though I had no appetite. My leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the pain had evolved from sharp and immediate to a deep, pulsing throb that synced with my heartbeat. I knew that was bad. The body going into shock, blood pooling in damaged tissue, the beginning of a process that could kill me just as surely as the cold. I tried to elevate the leg, propping it on one of the equipment cases, and I wrapped it as tightly as I could with strips torn from the cabin seat covers. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, the cold would jolt me awake, or the pain would spike, or I would hear something outside, real or imagined, that sent my heart racing. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the darkness that felt like a small miracle. I had survived the night, though I was not sure how much longer I could hold on. My leg had turned a mottled purple-black color that terrified me, and I had stopped being able to feel my toes sometime around 3 in the morning. The second granola bar went down in small bites, washed down with the last of the cold coffee, and I tried to make a plan. Movement was nearly impossible. Every attempt to put weight on my injured leg sent bolts of agony shooting up into my hip and made my vision go white at the edges. But staying still meant freezing, meant letting hypothermia creep deeper into my body with every passing hour. I decided to try and make some kind of signal, something that searchers might see from the air. Using the lighter and some of the aircraft's insulation material, I managed to start a small fire in a metal container I had salvaged from the wreckage. The smoke rose in a thin gray column against the pale sky, and I fed it with whatever I could find. Pieces of fabric, paper from the flight manual, strips of plastic that sent up black plumes. It was pitiful, really. A tiny thread of smoke in an endless white wilderness. But it was something to focus on, something to do besides lie there and wait for death. The second day passed in a haze of pain and cold and creeping despair. I talked to Dean's body, apologizing for things that made no sense, telling him about my failed marriage and my estranged sister, and the dog I had left with my ex-wife. I hallucinated at some point, saw my mother standing outside the shattered windshield, wearing the yellow dress she had been buried in, asking me why I had not called more often. The fire went out, and I could not get it started again. My fingers too clumsy, my coordination too far gone. I noticed that I had stopped shivering, and some distant part of my brain remembered that this was a very bad sign, that shivering was the body's way of generating heat, and when it stopped it meant you were in the final stages of hypothermia. I thought about giving up. The idea floated through my mind with a strange serenity. Just close my eyes, Let the cold take me. Stop fighting against something that was clearly inevitable. I probably would have done it too. I was ready. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the wind and the fog in my brain, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. I do not remember much of what happened next, just fragments and sensations. I remember trying to wave, to make some kind of movement that would catch their attention, but my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember the helicopter getting louder, circling overhead, and the overwhelming relief that flooded through me when I realized they had seen the wreckage. I remember voices, hands reaching for me, the painful brightness of a flashlight in my eyes. Someone was asking me questions, my name, where I was hurt, how long I had been out there, but my mouth would not form the words. They cut me out of the fuselage with tools that screamed and sparked, and then I was being lifted onto a stretcher, strapped down, carried through the snow toward the waiting helicopter. The warmth inside the aircraft hit me like a physical blow, and I started crying without meaning to, tears freezing on my cheeks before someone wiped them away. A paramedic was working on my leg, cutting away the makeshift bandages I had wrapped around it, and I saw his face go pale when he saw what was underneath. He said something to his partner that I could not hear over the rotor noise. But the look they exchanged told me everything. They put an IV in my arm and covered me with thermal blankets that felt like being wrapped in fire, and at some point I finally let myself slip into unconsciousness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Anchorage, missing my left leg below the knee. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that another few hours in that cold would have finished what the crash had started. The rescue team had found me thanks to a combination of factors. Dean's partial transmission had given them a general search area. A pilot flying a different route had spotted the smoke from my signal fire the previous day, and the Alaska State Troopers had coordinated a search effort that covered hundreds of square miles. They told me that Dean had died on impact, that he probably never felt any pain, and I choose to believe that even though I know they might have been saying it just to make me feel better. The company paid for my medical bills and my rehabilitation, and I got a settlement that was generous enough to let me start over somewhere warmer. I live in New Mexico now, working a desk job for a different telecommunications company, and I have not been on an airplane of any size since that day in March 2018. Sometimes I still dream about it, the endless white, the cold that felt like it was eating me from the inside out, the sound of Dean's last radio transmission cutting off mid-sentence. I wake up sweating despite the desert heat, reaching for a leg that is no longer there, and I have to remind myself that I made it out, that I survived. But a part of me is still out there in that frozen wilderness, sitting in the wreckage of a Cessna 185, watching the sun set and wondering if anyone is coming. That part of me never left, and I do not think it ever will. After my college graduation in 2015, my best friends and I made a pact to take one big adventure together before life pulled us in different directions. Mitch had just finished his EMT certification, and Carrie was about to start law school in September, so we had this narrow window in late August to do something wild. Alaska seemed perfect, raw, remote, untouched. Mitch had a cousin who worked on a fishing boat near Valdez, and he told us about this abandoned hunting lodge, about 40 miles from the nearest town, deep in the Chugach Mountains. The place had been closed since the early 90s, after the owner died, and nobody claimed the property. We figured we would hike out there, spend a couple of nights, take some photos, maybe see some wildlife. None of us could have imagined what was waiting in that rotting wooden structure, or that only 2 of us would make it back to civilization. We flew into Anchorage on a Thursday morning, rented a Jeep, and drove 6 hours to a small town called Copper Junction. Just a gas station, a general store, and maybe 15 houses scattered along a gravel road. The woman at the general store, a weathered lady in her 60s named Ruth, looked at us like we had announced plans to swim with sharks when we mentioned the old Whitaker Lodge. She told us people avoided that area, that hikers had reported seeing figures moving through the trees at night. Strange lights, things that made no sense. Her exact words were that the forest out there had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Mitch laughed it off, called it small-town superstition designed to scare tourists. Carrie and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We bought extra batteries, some canned food, and a paper map since cell service would be non-existent. Ruth watched us leave through the store window, and I remember thinking she looked almost sad, like she was watching people walk toward something terrible and knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hike took us nearly 7 hours. The trail, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely after the first 2 miles, and we had to navigate using the map and a compass Mitch brought. The Chugach Mountains are beautiful in a way that feels almost hostile, like the land is reminding you every second that you do not belong there. Spruce trees so thick you could walk 10 feet off the path and lose sight of your friends. Silence so deep that the snap of a twig under your boot sounds like a gunshot. Around mile 6, Carrie spotted something strange carved into a tree trunk, a crude symbol that looked like a stick figure with its arms raised, and below it, letters scratched deep into the bark. Turn back. We stood there staring at it for a long moment. Mitch said it was probably some bored hiker trying to scare people, maybe the same locals who told ghost stories to tourists. But the carving looked old, the edges worn smooth by years of weather. And there was something desperate about those letters, like whoever made them had used a rock or a knife and pressed hard, wanting to make sure the message would last. We reached the lodge just before sunset. The building was larger than I expected, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, most of the windows either broken or boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had given up. Moss covered everything, and there was this smell, thick and sour, that I assumed was just decades of rot and animal droppings. Mitch was the first one through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges and scraped against the floor when he pushed it open. Inside, the main room still had furniture, a couch with the stuffing torn out, a wooden table covered in dust, a stone fireplace filled with old ashes. But what stopped all 3 of us in our tracks was the kitchen area in the back corner. There were cans of food on the counter, and not old rusted ones from the 90s. These labels were modern, brands I recognized, and when Carrie picked one up, she whispered that the expiration date was still a year away. Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. We should have turned around right then, hiked back through the darkness if we had to. But we were tired. It was getting dark fast, and Mitch convinced us that it was probably just another group of hikers who had passed through. We decided to stay the night and leave at first light. That decision haunts me every single day. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room near the fireplace, figuring it was the safest spot since we could see both the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. Mitch got a small fire going using some dry wood we found stacked behind the couch. Another detail that should have alarmed us more than it did, because who stacks firewood in an abandoned building? Carrie was quiet, kept glancing toward the dark hallway that led to what looked like storage rooms in the back. Around 9, she said she needed to use the bathroom and grabbed her flashlight. The outhouse was about 30 yards behind the lodge, a tilted wooden box that somehow still stood despite looking ready to collapse. She was gone for maybe 10 minutes when we heard her scream. Not a startled yelp, but a real scream, the kind that carries pure terror in it. Mitch and I grabbed our flashlights and ran outside, calling her name, our beams cutting through the darkness. We found her standing behind the outhouse, flashlight pointed at the ground, her whole body trembling. She could barely get the words out. She kept saying there were bones, human bones, and when I looked down I saw them too. A scattered pile of what was unmistakably a human rib cage, a femur, fragments of a skull half buried in the dirt. The bones were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. Some still had dried tissue clinging to them. Mitch tried to stay calm, said it could be anything, maybe a hunter who got lost and died of exposure years ago. But Carrie pointed her flashlight a few feet to the left, and there was another pile, and another beyond that. At least 4 distinct groupings of human remains, all within a 20-foot radius of that outhouse, like someone had been dumping bodies there for years. The smell I had noticed earlier, the one I blamed on rot and animals, it suddenly made a different kind of sense. We needed to leave immediately. All of us agreed on that. But it was pitch black now and the trail was impossible to navigate at night. One wrong step and you could fall into a ravine, or walk in circles until exhaustion took you. Mitch said we would barricade ourselves inside, take shifts staying awake, and leave the second the sun came up. We dragged the heavy wooden table against the front door and pushed the couch against the back entrance. Carrie found a rusty hunting knife in one of the drawers and held onto it like her life depended on it, because at that point, we all understood it might. None of us slept. We sat in a triangle facing outward, flashlights ready, listening to every creak and groan of that old building, waiting for morning. Around 3 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, human. They moved slowly from one end to the other, paused near the boarded window, then continued around the side of the building. Mitch grabbed a thick piece of firewood and positioned himself near the front door. Carrie had the knife raised, her knuckles white around the handle. I held my flashlight like a weapon, which felt pathetic, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped at the back entrance, and then came 3 slow knocks on the door. 1, 2, 3. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then a voice, low and gravelly, muffled through the wood. "I know you're in there. I saw your fire." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mitch whispered for us to stay quiet. Maybe whoever it was would leave if we did not respond. For a long moment there was silence. Then the voice again, closer now, like the person had pressed their face against the door. "This is my home. You're sleeping in my home." The handle jiggled. The couch we had pushed against the door shifted an inch. Carrie let out a small whimper, and I grabbed her arm, squeezing hard, begging her silently to stay quiet. The jiggling stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. We heard them circle the building once more, then fade into the forest. For the next 2 hours, nothing. Just the wind and the occasional crack of branches in the distance. By 5, the sky started to lighten, and we made the decision to run. We grabbed our packs, left everything else, and Mitch pulled the table away from the front door. He opened it slowly, checking both directions, and motioned for us to follow. We made it maybe 50 yards into the tree line when Carrie suddenly stopped and pointed back toward the lodge. There was a man standing on the porch, watching us. He was tall, gaunt, with a beard that hung past his chest and clothes so filthy they looked like they had fused to his skin. He did not move, did not chase us, just stood there with his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side like a curious dog. And then he smiled. Not a threatening smile, but something worse, something empty and patient, like he knew exactly where we were going and had no doubt he would find us again. We ran. We ran faster than I have ever run in my life. Branches whipping our faces, rocks twisting under our feet, not daring to look back. We had been moving for maybe an hour when Mitch stopped and said he needed to check the map. We were lost. Nothing looked familiar, and in our panic we had veered completely off the route we had marked the day before. The forest was dense here, the trees so close together that sunlight barely penetrated, and everything looked the same in every direction. Carrie was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with her sleeve. I kept scanning the trees behind us, expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge at any moment. Mitch spread the map on a fallen log and tried to orient us using the compass, but his hands were unsteady and the needle kept jumping. That is when we heard it. A sharp whistle, high-pitched and deliberate, coming from somewhere to our left. Then another whistle answered from the right, and a third from behind us. There was more than one person out there. The man at the lodge was not alone. Mitch shoved the map in his pack and grabbed Carrie by the arm, pulling her forward. We picked a direction and moved as fast as we could, trying to stay quiet but knowing that whoever was out there already knew exactly where we were. The whistles continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like they were hurting us somewhere specific. Around midday, we stumbled into a small clearing and found another carved message on a tree. This one was newer, the letters still pale against the dark bark. No one comes. Below it, scratched in smaller, shakier writing, "He keeps us here." Carrie started hyperventilating, and I had to hold her face in my hands and force her to look at me, to breathe with me, to stay focused. Mitch was pacing the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of a trail, when the attack came. The man appeared from nowhere. Not the bearded one from the lodge, but someone younger, faster, wearing torn military fatigues and carrying a length of rusted chain. He swung it at Mitch before any of us could react, catching him across the back of the shoulders and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Carrie screamed and lunged with her knife, slashing wildly, and caught the attacker across the forearm. He howled and stumbled backward, giving Mitch enough time to scramble to his feet. I grabbed a rock the size of my fist and threw it as hard as I could, hitting the man in the chest. He looked at me with these pale, empty eyes, not angry, not pained, just hollow, and then retreated into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. Mitch was bleeding through his shirt, deep welts already forming where the chain had struck. We had to keep moving. For the next 3 hours, we pushed through the forest with no real sense of direction, just desperate to put distance between us and whoever was hunting us. Mitch was slowing down, the pain in his back making every step a struggle, and Carrie had gone silent in a way that scared me more than her crying had. The whistles had stopped, which somehow felt worse, like they had decided to let us exhaust ourselves before closing in. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard something that made me want to collapse with relief. The sound of running water. We followed it and found a river, maybe 30 feet wide, moving fast with snowmelt from the mountains. I remembered from the map that a river ran near the main road about 15 miles from where we had started. If we followed it downstream, we might find civilization. We waded in, the cold shocking the breath out of us, and let the current carry us as much as we could manage while keeping our footing. Mitch slipped twice, and the second time, Carrie and I had to drag him up before the water pulled him under. We stayed in that river for what felt like hours, our legs going numb, our teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. But nobody followed us into the water. Whatever advantage they had in the forest, the river took it away. Just before sunset, we saw a bridge in the distance. A real bridge, concrete and metal, with a gravel road running across it. We climbed out of the river on shaking legs and stumbled up the embankment to the road. A pickup truck came by within 20 minutes, driven by a man named Earl who took one look at us and did not ask questions, just told us to get in. He drove us straight to a state trooper station in a town called Ridgewater, about 60 miles from Copper Junction. We told them everything, the lodge, the bones, the man on the porch, the whistles, the attack. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to something darker as we spoke. One of the troopers, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, finally said they had been looking for a man named Vernon Crisp for almost 8 years. He had escaped from a corrections facility in 2007, serving time for multiple counts of kidnapping and assault. They had assumed he fled to Canada or died in the wilderness. Instead, he had built himself a compound out there, attracting other fugitives, other broken men who wanted to disappear. The trooper said they had received reports over the years, hikers talking about ghosts in the forest, strange figures, carved warnings, but nobody had ever come back with enough information to launch a real search. Until us. The raid happened 3 days later. State troopers, FBI, search and rescue teams. They went in with helicopters and dogs and enough manpower to sweep every inch of that mountain. They found Vernon Crisp in the lodge, sitting in a chair by the fireplace like he had been expecting them. He did not resist. The 2 other men they captured in the surrounding forest put up more of a fight, but both were taken alive. What they found behind that lodge was worse than anything we had seen. 17 sets of remains, some dating back to the late 90s, others much more recent. They also found a root cellar about 100 yards from the main building, dug into the hillside and hidden by brush. Inside were journals, dozens of them, written by people who had been kept there, some for weeks, some for months. The entries described everything: the captures, the isolation, The way Vernon would release them into the forest and hunt them for sport. The way some prisoners were forced to help him in exchange for their lives. Those carved warnings we had seen on the trees were made by the ones who managed to escape the cellar briefly. Desperate attempts to warn anyone who might come after them. Most of those people never made it out of the forest. Their bones ended up behind the outhouse with all the others. Mitch spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from an infection that developed in his wounds. Carrie finished law school but changed her focus to victims advocacy. She works with families of missing persons now, helps them navigate the system when the police stop looking. I still live in the same apartment I had before Alaska, still work the same job, still see the same people. But something fundamental broke inside me during those hours in the forest. I check the locks on my doors 4 or 5 times before I can sleep. I cannot hear a whistle without my chest tightening. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Ruth at that general store, how she tried to warn us and we laughed it off as superstition. The ghosts she talked about were real. They were just made of flesh and bone, like us. That is the thing nobody tells you about monsters. They do not need to be supernatural to destroy you. They just need to be patient and hidden, and willing to wait for the next group of people who think the wilderness is empty. It never is. I know that now. I will never forget it. Every summer since my dad passed, I make the trip up to the Kenai Peninsula to fish for sockeye salmon. It started as a way to feel close to him again, doing something we used to do together when I was a teenager. But over the years it became my thing, my way of resetting before another school year of teaching 4th graders in Seattle. My birthday falls in late July, and turning 37 alone on a riverbank with nothing but the sound of rushing water and birdsong felt like exactly what I needed. I had been doing this solo trip for 6 years without any real incident. A few close calls with moose, one scary moment when I slipped on wet rocks and almost went into the current, but nothing that made me question whether I should keep coming back. The spot I always use is about 4 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that most people skip because there are easier fishing spots closer to civilization. That remoteness was always the appeal. I flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning and picked up my rental truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled like cigarettes and prior renters who did not believe in air freshener. The drive down to the peninsula took about 4 hours, and I stopped in Soldotna to grab last-minute supplies and check in with the ranger station like I always do. The guy working the desk, a younger ranger I had not seen before, warned me about increased bear activity in the area. He said the salmon run was strong this year, which meant the browns were coming down from higher elevations earlier than usual. I thanked him and told him I had bear spray and air horn and knew how to store my food properly. He gave me this look, not condescending exactly, but like he wanted to say something more and decided against it. I wish now that I had asked him what he was thinking. I wish I had paid more attention to the weight behind that look, instead of brushing it off as a ranger doing his job. The hike in took me about 2.5 hours with my pack, which was heavier than usual, because I had brought extra food for a 5-day stay. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left to set up, and maybe get a few casts in before dinner. The spot sits on a slight rise about 60 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by a thick stand of spruce trees on 3 sides. The river curves there, creating a natural pool where the salmon tend to gather before pushing upstream. I had caught my limit here every single year. I set up my tent, hung my food cache from the bare wire that someone had installed years ago between 2 tall spruces, and took a walk down to the water to check conditions. The river was running a bit higher than I remembered from previous years, probably from snowmelt, and the water had that murky, glacial color that makes it hard to see more than a few inches below the surface. I noticed fish jumping out near the middle of the current, silver flashes catching the late afternoon sun, and I felt that familiar excitement in my chest. That first evening was perfect. I caught 3 nice sockeyes before the light started fading, kept 2 and released 1, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove while listening to the river. I did everything right with my food prep, cleaned the fish downstream from my camp, washed my hands and arms thoroughly, changed into clean clothes that I kept sealed in a dry bag. I was careful. I am always careful. Around 10, which is still pretty bright that far north in July, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Maybe 200 yards away, a large brown shape moving through the brush. I could not see it clearly, but I knew what it was from the way it moved, that distinctive rolling gait. It did not seem interested in me, just working its way along the far shore, probably fishing in its own spots. I watched until it disappeared into the trees. Then I got into my tent and zipped everything up tight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to see one from a safe distance. I remember feeling grateful, not scared. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving through the brush near my tent. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I always keep next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled. I could track them by sound, moving from the tree line behind my tent toward the river, then back again. At one point they stopped, and I heard this sound, a deep huffing breath followed by a low grunt. It was close enough that I could smell it, that musky, wet dog smell mixed with something rotten, probably fish. I do not know how long I lay there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds moved off toward the river and I heard splashing in the distance. I did not sleep again that night. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to every small noise, my body so tense that my muscles ached by morning. When the sun came up around 5, I got out of my tent to check the area. My legs were shaky and I felt that sick exhaustion you get when adrenaline has been pumping through you for hours. The ground near the tree line was torn up, deep gouges in the soft earth where something had been digging. And then I saw the tracks. They were massive, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen in my 6 years of coming here. I put my boot next to one of them for reference, and the print was easily twice the size of my foot, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. I am not a wildlife expert, but I have seen enough brown bear tracks to know that this was an unusually large animal. The tracks led from the woods to a spot maybe 20 feet from my tent, circled around, and then headed down toward the river. I stood there looking at how close they came to where I had been sleeping, separated by nothing but a thin layer of nylon, and I seriously considered packing up and hiking out right then, but I talked myself out of it. That is what I keep coming back to, that moment of decision. I told myself the bear was just passing through, that it had not tried to get into my food cache, that it was probably more interested in the salmon than in me. I told myself I had driven 8 hours and hiked 4 miles, and I was not going to let one close encounter ruin my trip. I checked my food hang, which was untouched, and I made noise while I cooked breakfast, banging pots together and talking loudly to myself like all the guides recommend. I even did some fishing that morning, though I stayed closer to camp than usual, and kept my bear spray clipped to my waders at all times. I caught 1 salmon and released it because I did not want to deal with cleaning fish and creating more smells. The whole time I was on the water, I kept scanning the banks, the tree line, the bend in the river where I had seen the bear the night before. Nothing. The day was bright and warm, birds singing, river flowing, and I started to relax a little. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rock near the water, eating a granola bar and resting my feet when I saw it. The bear emerged from the brush on my side of the river, maybe 150 yards upstream. It was enormous, easily the biggest brown bear I had ever seen outside of photographs. Its fur was dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, with a distinctive silver patch on its shoulder. It walked to the water's edge and stood there, and then it turned its head and looked directly at me. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The bear saw me. It knew I was there. And instead of doing what bears usually do when they encounter humans, instead of running away or at least moving off, it started walking toward me along the riverbank. Not charging, not running, just walking, steady and deliberate, like it had somewhere to be and I was on the path. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bear spray with one hand and my air horn with the other. I started backing away from the river toward my campsite, keeping the bear in my sight the whole time. I pressed the air horn, and the blast echoed across the water, loud enough to hurt my ears. The bear paused for a second, maybe two, then kept coming. I yelled and waved my arms over my head, trying to make myself look bigger. Nothing. It just kept that same steady pace, closing the distance between us. 75 yards now, maybe less. I could see its face clearly. The small dark eyes, the dish-shaped profile, the way its ears were pointed forward with focus and intent. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. You cannot outrun a brown bear. You cannot outswim one either. I kept backing up, stumbling over rocks and roots, and I hit the air horn again, 3 short blasts. The bear did not even flinch. It reached the spot where I had been sitting and it stopped there, sniffing the rock, sniffing the ground where I had dropped my granola bar wrapper. And then it lifted its head and looked at me again, and it made this sound, a low, rumbling grunt that I felt in my chest more than heard. I do not know what made me decide to go for the river. Maybe some survival instinct kicked in, or maybe I just panicked and made a stupid choice. My campsite was behind me, but the bear was between me and the trail that led back to the road. The river was to my left, and on the other side of the river was more wilderness, but at least it was distance. At least it was something. The bear started moving again, faster now, and I turned and ran for the water. The cold hit me like a wall when I plunged in, that glacial runoff so cold it locks up your muscles and steals your breath. I was only in up to my waist, but the current was strong, pulling at me, and I could barely feel my legs. I pushed forward, half swimming and half wading, trying to reach the far bank. I heard splashing behind me, and I did not look back. I just kept going, my arms numb and clumsy in the freezing water. The riverbed was all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, and twice I went under, swallowing water that tasted like ice and silt. When I finally dragged myself onto the opposite bank, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I turned around, expecting to see the bear swimming after me or already on my side of the river. But it was just standing at the edge of the water on the far bank, right where I had gone in, watching me. It did not try to follow, it just stood there, and after a minute or two it turned and walked back toward my campsite, disappearing into the trees near where my tent was set up. I was soaking wet, freezing, starting to feel that dangerous sleepiness that comes with hypothermia. And all my gear, my food, my truck keys, my phone, everything was on the other side of the river, with a bear that had just chased me into glacial water. I had my bear spray still clutched in my hand, but that was it. No dry clothes, no fire starter, no way to call for help. I started walking downstream along the bank, trying to keep moving, trying to generate body heat. I knew there was a fishing lodge about 6 miles downriver. I had seen it on my map when planning the trip. 6 miles through dense brush and uneven terrain in wet clothes with the temperature dropping as evening approached. I did not think about whether I could make it. I just walked. It took me almost 5 hours to reach that lodge. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and a guest spotted me, I could not feel my feet and my lips were blue. They wrapped me in blankets and called for a medical helicopter because my core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, which is apparently when organs start having trouble. I spent 2 nights in a hospital in Anchorage being treated for moderate hypothermia and mild frostbite on 3 of my toes. The Rangers went back to my campsite the next day and found my tent shredded, my food cache pulled down from the wire and scattered everywhere. They found tracks all around the site, the same massive prints I had seen that morning. They told me later that there had been reports of a large male brown bear in that area, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans, possibly because someone had been feeding it earlier in the season. They never caught it as far as I know. I still go fishing every summer, but not there, never there again. And every time I see a bear in the distance now, even in a zoo, I feel my chest tighten and I remember that steady walk along the riverbank, those small, dark eyes fixed on me. and I remember how it feels to be looked at not as a threat or a curiosity, but as something else entirely. November in Alaska feels like the world is slowly dying, and that particular November felt worse than most. I had been covering crime stories for the Anchorage Daily Herald since my journalism school graduation back in 2009, staying in this frozen corner of the country because the isolation bred stories nobody else wanted to touch. My editor dropped a folder on my desk containing 6 missing persons cases spanning 15 years, all connected to an abandoned copper mine called Raven Shaft near a forgotten town named Ketchum Falls. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a collapse killed 4 workers, but hikers and amateur explorers kept wandering in over the decades. None of them came back out. Local authorities had stopped sending search parties after the 3rd disappearance because the cave system was too unstable, too deep, and too cold. The families never got answers. The cases went cold, and something about that silence made me volunteer to investigate. I spent 3 weeks researching before I ever set foot near that mountain. The mine entrance sat about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable once the heavy snow arrived in December. I connected with a geological survey team from the University of Fairbanks, who had been trying to get funding to map the cave system for years. Their leader was a woman named Ingrid Solberg, maybe 50 years old with sun-damaged skin and a handshake that could crush walnuts. She had lost a graduate student to Raven Shaft in 2014 and had been petitioning the state to either seal the entrance permanently or fund a proper documentation expedition. When I told her about the article I wanted to write, she offered me something better than an interview. She invited me to join a 5-person team heading into the mine that Friday to recover whatever evidence they could find before winter sealed the mountain for good. I said yes without hesitating, which, looking back, was the first of many mistakes. Our team assembled at a ranger station about 20 miles from the site on a Friday morning, so cold that my breath crystallized on my eyelashes. Besides Ingrid and myself, there was her colleague Desmond Yates, a soft-spoken geologist in his early 60s, who had mapped caves across 3 continents, and 2 younger researchers named Cynthia Park and Jonah Fielding. Cynthia handled the audio and video documentation equipment, a serious woman with cropped black hair who barely spoke during the drive-up. Jonah was the safety coordinator, responsible for the ropes, the harnesses, and the emergency protocols that I prayed we would never need. He had this nervous habit of checking his gear over and over, running his fingers along the carabiners like rosary beads. The ranger who met us was a grizzled man named Cliff Bjornson, who had been stationed in this region for over 20 years. He made us sign liability waivers that essentially said the state of Alaska bore no responsibility if we died in that hole. He also told us that if we were not back by nightfall, nobody was coming to find us until spring. The hike to Raven Shaft took nearly 4 hours through terrain that wanted to kill us with every step. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through dense spruce forest before climbing a rocky slope scattered with loose shale and patches of black ice. Ingrid led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, though I noticed her pace slow as we approached the final ridge. The mine entrance appeared suddenly, a dark wound in the gray mountainside framed by rotting timber supports that had somehow survived decades of harsh winters. A faded warning sign hung crooked from a rusted chain, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and lichen. The opening was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, sloping downward at a steep angle into absolute darkness. Standing there, feeling the cold air rushing up from the depths like the mountain was exhaling, I understood why people called this place cursed. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it felt hungry in a way that only truly dangerous places can feel. We descended into Raven Shaft just after noon, roped together in a line with Jonah at the front and Desmond bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped dramatically within the first 100 feet, and the quality of darkness changed from the soft gray of an overcast day to something thicker, something that seemed to press against our headlamps like a living thing. The main shaft angled downward for about 300 meters before opening into a large chamber that the original miners had used as a staging area. Rusted equipment still littered the floor. Pickaxes and ore carts and coils of ancient rope turned brittle with age. Our boots crunched on a mixture of gravel and ice crystals that had formed over decades of water seeping through microscopic cracks in the rock. Ingrid pointed her light toward the far end of the chamber, where 3 tunnels branched off into different directions, each one disappearing into its own private darkness. She explained that the left tunnel led to the collapsed section where the 4 miners had died in 1987. The middle tunnel went deeper into the mountain, descending another 200 meters before dead-ending at a flooded shaft. The right tunnel was where most of the missing persons had last been seen, according to the sparse evidence that search teams had recovered over the years. We took the right tunnel, moving slowly and carefully along a path that grew narrower with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and in several places we had to duck beneath rock formations that jutted down like broken teeth. Cynthia documented everything with her camera, capturing the strange beauty and the undeniable menace of a place that had swallowed so many people whole. About 40 minutes into the tunnel, Jonah stopped us with a raised fist. His headlamp had caught something reflective ahead, wedged between 2 rocks near the base of the wall. He crouched down and pulled out a hiking boot, faded orange with a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Inside the boot, still laced tight, was a wool sock. Ingrid checked her files and confirmed that the boot matched the description of gear worn by a hiker named Russell Adkins, a 24-year-old college student who had entered Raven Shaft alone in 2016 and never returned. We found only the one boot, no sign of the other, and no sign of Russell. Cynthia photographed the discovery from multiple angles while I stood there wondering what kind of circumstances would cause someone to leave behind a single boot in a place like this. The tunnel opened into a second chamber about an hour later, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. This room felt different immediately, and it took me a moment to understand why. There were signs of habitation everywhere. A sleeping bag lay unrolled against the far wall, its fabric torn and stained with something dark that could have been mud or could have been blood. Nearby sat a camping stove, 2 empty water bottles, a scattered pile of energy bar wrappers, and a backpack with its contents dumped across the stone floor. Ingrid approached the scene carefully, instructing everyone to stay back until she could assess the situation. She crouched beside the backpack and read the name embroidered on its strap, aloud. Gretchen Moody. According to Ingrid's research, Gretchen had been part of a group of 4 amateur spelunkers who entered Raven Shaft in October of 2017. The group had planned a 2-day exploration and packed supplies accordingly. When they failed to return after 5 days, authorities mounted a limited search that recovered nothing. Now we were looking at proof that at least one of them had survived long enough to set up camp deep inside this mountain. Desmond found the audio recorder tucked inside a crevice near the sleeping bag, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. It was a small digital device, the kind hikers use to document their journeys, and miraculously, the battery still held a faint charge. Ingrid wanted to wait until we returned to the surface to examine the contents, but Cynthia argued that we needed to know what we were dealing with before going any deeper. The group voted, and curiosity won. We gathered in a loose circle, while Cynthia connected the recorder to a portable speaker she carried in her kit. The first file was dated October 17, 2017, recorded in the cheerful voice of a young woman who introduced herself as Gretchen. She described the group's excitement about exploring a cave system that few people had ever documented. The other voices in the background belonged to her companions, a man named Isaac, another woman named Shelley, and a 4th member whose name I could not quite make out through the static. They sounded happy. They sounded alive. And somehow knowing what came next made listening to those first innocent minutes almost unbearable. The second recording was made 2 days later, and the change in tone was immediate. Gretchen's voice trembled as she explained that a rockfall had blocked their exit route. Isaac had tried to find an alternate path but returned after several hours with bad news. Every passage they explored either dead-ended or looped back to the same chamber. Their food was running low. Their flashlight batteries were failing one by one. Shelley had injured her ankle during the initial collapse and could barely walk. The fourth member, whose name was finally clear in this recording as Bo, kept insisting that he had heard movement somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Not animals, he said. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The others dismissed him as paranoid, but Gretchen's voice carried a note of doubt that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of something falling in the distance, followed by Shelley screaming, and then silence. We sat in that cold chamber, 5 people huddled around a speaker, listening to the echoes of a nightmare that had played out in this exact spot years before we arrived. The third recording was the worst. Gretchen spoke in a whisper, her words rushed and broken by long pauses where she seemed to be listening for something. 6 days had passed since the collapse. Isaac was dead. She did not explain how or why, only that it had happened during an argument about their remaining water supply. Bo had disappeared into one of the side tunnels 2 days earlier and never came back. Shelley's ankle had become infected, and she spent most of her time unconscious, burning with fever. Gretchen described the darkness as a weight pressing down on her chest, the silence broken only by Shelley's labored breathing, and the constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. She mentioned the footsteps again. Bo had been right, she said. Someone else was in these tunnels. She had heard them too, always just beyond the reach of her dying flashlight, always moving away when she called out. She begged whoever found this recording to tell her mother that she had tried to survive. She begged them to bring her body home. The recording ended with a sound that none of us could identify, a low, scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by Gretchen whispering a single word that sounded like "run." Nobody spoke for a long time after the recordings ended. Ingrid finally broke the silence by announcing that we had collected enough evidence and needed to begin our ascent before we lost too much daylight. I noticed that her hands moved with a new urgency as she packed the recorder into a protective case. Jonah started organizing our gear for the return journey, counting heads as he always did before any movement. He counted twice, then a third time. His face went pale in the harsh white light of our headlamps, and he asked a question that turned my insides to ice. Where was Desmond? We all looked around the chamber, calling his name into the darkness, our voices bouncing off the wet stone walls and returning to us distorted and strange. Desmond had been standing at the edge of the group just minutes ago, examining some markings on the wall near the tunnel entrance. Now that spot was empty. His pack lay on the ground where he had set it down, but the man himself had vanished without a sound. Cynthia pointed her camera light toward the tunnel we had entered through, then toward 2 smaller passages on the opposite side of the chamber that we had not yet explored. Nothing. No movement. No answer to our increasingly frantic calls. Jonah wanted to search immediately, but Ingrid overruled him with a voice that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She reminded us of the protocols we had all agreed to before entering the mine. If someone became separated, the group would mark the location, return to the surface, and contact authorities with proper rescue equipment. Going deeper into an unstable cave system to search for a missing person was exactly how more people ended up dead. I understood her logic, but standing there in that chamber surrounded by the belongings of people who had died alone in the dark, the thought of leaving Desmond behind felt monstrous. We compromised. Jonah and I would check the 2 unexplored passages for exactly 5 minutes each, while Ingrid and Cynthia stayed at the camp to maintain a light beacon. The first passage curved sharply after about 30 feet and ended in a wall of collapsed rubble that looked decades old. The second passage went deeper, angling downward at a steep grade, and about 100 feet in, my headlamp caught something that stopped me cold. A footprint in the mud. Fresh. Pointing away from the chamber, heading deeper into the mountain, the tread pattern matched the boots Desmond had been wearing. I called his name one more time, my voice swallowed by the tunnel ahead. Nothing came back except a faint echo and something else. Something that might have been the wind moving through cracks in the rock, or might have been breathing. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the chamber. Our 5 minutes were up. When we returned to Ingrid and Cynthia, I told them about the footprint, expecting Ingrid to change her mind about the search. Instead, her expression hardened into something I recognized from years of interviewing people who had made impossible choices. She said that Desmond knew the risks better than any of us. She said that if he had walked deeper into that tunnel on his own, there was a reason, and if he had been taken, then whatever took him was still down there with us. Either way, 3 more bodies would not bring him home. We gathered what evidence we could carry, including Gretchen's recorder and the photographs Cynthia had taken, and we began our ascent. The climb back to the surface felt twice as long as the descent. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to move at the edges of our lights. I kept looking back, hoping to see Desmond's familiar silhouette catching up to us, but the darkness behind remained absolute and empty. We emerged from Raven Shaft just as the last gray light of day was fading from the sky. Cliff Bjornsson was waiting at the ranger station with coffee and questions. When we told him about Desmond, his face registered no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation that suggested he had heard this story before. He made calls to the state police and the search and rescue coordinator, but I could tell from his tone that nobody expected a recovery operation. The official report, which I obtained months later through a records request, concluded that Desmond Yates had likely become disoriented in the cave system and fallen into one of the many unmapped shafts that riddled the lower levels. His body was never recovered. The entrance to Raven Shaft was sealed with concrete and steel bars the following spring, and a new sign was erected warning that trespassers would face criminal prosecution. I published my article in February, though the editors cut most of the details about the recordings and focused instead on the broader issue of abandoned mine safety. The families of the missing contacted me for months afterward, desperate for any information I had not included in the story. I told them what I could. I did not tell them about the footsteps that Gretchen heard, or about the fresh boot print leading into darkness, or about the sound I heard just before Jonah pulled me back from that tunnel. A sound like someone whispering my name from very far away, in a voice that almost sounded like Desmond. My truck died somewhere between Talk and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that looked exactly like the last 100 miles. White, flat, and empty. The temperature gauge had been showing -47 for the past hour, and I remember thinking that number seemed almost fake, like something from a documentary about Antarctica, rather than a road I was actually driving on. I had taken this relocation job from Seattle to Fairbanks because the salary was too good to pass up, and my 10-year high school reunion a few months back had been a reminder that everyone I grew up with was buying houses and having kids, while I was still splitting rent with roommates. The plan seemed reasonable when I mapped it out. Drive the Alaska Highway in early December, get settled before the holidays, start fresh in January. I had packed blankets, extra food, flares, a full tank of gas, everything the internet told me to bring. But sitting there watching my dashboard light up with warnings before the engine gave one last shudder and went silent, I understood that all the preparation in the world means nothing when you are alone in a place that wants to kill you. I turned the key again and again, maybe 20 times, and each attempt produced a weaker sound until there was nothing but a faint click that reminded me of a dying heartbeat. The heating system stopped the moment the engine quit, and I could feel the cold pushing into the cabin almost immediately, like it had been pressed against the windows just waiting for its chance. I grabbed my phone knowing there would be no signal, and I was right. No bars, no data, nothing but a useless rectangle of glass and metal. Outside, the sun hung low even though my watch said it was barely 2 in the afternoon. That strange Arctic winter light that looks more like a permanent sunset than actual daytime. I figured I had maybe 3 hours before full darkness, and the thought of spending a night in this truck with no heat made my chest tight. I looked out at the road in both directions and saw absolutely nothing. No cars, no buildings, no smoke from distant chimneys, just an endless white plain broken only by the dark line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and for the first time since I started this drive, I felt genuinely afraid. I tried to remember what I had read about survival in extreme cold. Stay with your vehicle. That was the main advice everywhere online. Your car is shelter, it is visible to rescuers, it protects you from wind. But the articles I had read were written for situations where someone might actually come looking for you, where the temperature was maybe -20 and you could survive a night bundled up in blankets. This was different. At -47, the math changes completely. I had read somewhere that exposed skin gets frostbite in under 5 minutes at these temperatures, that your core body temperature starts dropping almost immediately once you stop producing heat. The blankets I had brought were good for a camping trip, not for a night in an unheated metal box when the air itself feels like it is trying to freeze your lungs. I did the calculation in my head. If no one drove by tonight, and the temperature dropped even further after dark like it always does, I would be dead by morning. That was not pessimism, that was just physics. I remembered passing a sign about 30 minutes back, something about a highway maintenance station 8 miles ahead. At the time I barely noticed it, just another green rectangle on an endless road. Now that sign felt like a lifeline, the only piece of information that might save me. 8 miles was not that far. I had run half marathons before, back when I lived in Seattle, and thought jogging along the waterfront made me some kind of athlete. But 8 miles in this cold, in snow boots and a jacket designed for Pacific Northwest rain rather than Arctic winter, with the sun going down, and no guarantee that the station would even be staffed. That was something else entirely. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the windows start to frost over from the inside, feeling my fingers getting stiff even with gloves on. The decision made itself. Staying meant certain death by morning. Walking meant maybe dying, but also maybe living. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the granola bars and water bottles I had brought, wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were exposed, and stepped out of the truck into cold that hit me like a physical wall. The first breath I took outside felt like inhaling broken glass. The air was so cold that my nostrils stuck together for a second, and I had to breathe through my mouth just to get oxygen in. My eyes watered immediately, and I could feel the moisture trying to freeze on my eyelashes, turning them stiff and clumped. I started walking north along the highway, keeping the asphalt under my feet because I knew that wandering off into the snow would mean losing my sense of direction within minutes. The snow on the road had been packed down by whatever sparse traffic came through, but it was still slippery, and each step required concentration. I told myself to keep a steady pace, not too fast because sweating would be deadly. I had read that wet clothing in extreme cold is basically a death sentence, that the moisture pulls heat from your body faster than the air alone ever could. So I walked like I was on a casual stroll, except every part of my body was screaming that something was wrong, that I should be running, that I needed to get somewhere warm right now. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to notice that I could not feel my toes anymore. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks and my heaviest boots, the ones I had bought specifically for this trip, and none of it mattered. The cold had found a way in, like it always does, creeping through the rubber soles and the insulation and the wool until my feet felt like blocks of wood at the end of my legs. I kept walking because stopping was not an option, but I started doing this thing where I would curl my toes inside my boots, trying to force blood into them, trying to feel anything at all. My fingers were next, even inside the gloves, even tucked into my jacket pockets. The tips went numb first, then the knuckles. Then that numb feeling started creeping up toward my wrists. I checked my watch and realized I had been walking for almost 40 minutes, which meant I had covered maybe 2 miles at most. The maintenance station was still 6 miles away, and the sun had dropped noticeably lower, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they did not mean I was running out of time. Around the 1-hour mark, something changed in my head. I noticed it happening, which is the strange part, I was aware that my thoughts were getting slower, like my brain was a computer running too many programs at once. I would start thinking about something like how far I had walked or whether I should eat one of the granola bars, and then I would just lose the thread of it completely. I found myself stopping in the middle of the road for no reason, just standing there staring at the horizon, and I had to physically force myself to start moving again. My body wanted to stop. Every cell in me was saying, just sit down for a minute, just rest, just take a break. I knew that was the hypothermia talking, that sitting down meant dying. But knowing something and feeling something are two completely different things when your core temperature is dropping and your brain is not getting enough warm blood. I started talking to myself out loud, just to have something to focus on, just to keep my mind from drifting into that soft gray fog that kept trying to swallow my thoughts. The road started to look different after a while, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I could have sworn there was a building up ahead at one point, a dark shape against the snow, and I walked faster toward it for maybe 5 minutes before realizing it was just a shadow, some trick of the fading light on the landscape. That scared me more than anything had so far. If I was already seeing things that were not there, how much longer before I walked off the road entirely without realizing it? The highway was my only guide, the only thing keeping me pointed in the right direction. And if I lost it, I would be wandering in circles until I collapsed. I tried to focus harder, tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt directly in front of me, but my vision kept going blurry at the edges, and I had to blink constantly to clear it. The tears would freeze almost instantly, gluing my eyelids together for a half second each time, and wiping them away with my frozen gloves just made it worse. I realized I had stopped feeling cold, which should have been a relief, but I knew it was actually a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, when the cold stops hurting, that means your body has given up trying to warm itself. That means you are in serious trouble. I do not know exactly when I left the road. That is the part that haunts me when I try to piece together what happened. The gap in my memory, where the highway just disappears, and suddenly I was walking through open snow with no idea how I got there. One moment I was following the dark line of asphalt, telling myself to keep going, keep moving, and the next I was knee-deep in powder with nothing around me but white in every direction. I must have wandered off during one of those foggy moments when my brain checked out, maybe saw another phantom building in the distance and walked toward it without thinking. I tried to turn around, tried to find the road again, but everything looked exactly the same. Flat white ground meeting gray-blue sky and a perfect circle around me, like I was standing in the center of an empty dome. I picked a direction and started walking, telling myself it had to be the right way. But even as I moved, I knew I was guessing, knew I could be walking deeper into nothing instead of back toward the highway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin red line on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping even further. I could feel it in my chest, each breath harder than the last, like the air itself was thickening into something my lungs could not process. My legs stopped working properly somewhere in that white emptiness. First, they just felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and then they started refusing to bend the way I wanted them to. I fell twice, maybe 3 times, and getting back up took longer each time. The last time I went down, I remember lying there in the snow and thinking how soft it was, how it almost felt warm compared to the air, how maybe I could just rest here for a minute before continuing. Part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, screaming that this was exactly how people die, but that voice seemed far away now, like someone yelling from another room. I managed to push myself to my knees, then to my feet, but standing felt like an achievement that took everything I had. I looked around and realized I could not see anything anymore. Not the road, not the sun, not any landmark at all. Just darkness creeping in from every direction and the snow beneath my feet, and this incredible tiredness that made every thought feel like pushing a boulder uphill. I took a few more steps, maybe 10 or 20, and then I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my body simply would not go any further. My legs locked up, my knees buckled, and I went down into the snow one final time. I woke up in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 days later, and for the first few hours I had no idea where I was or how I got there. A nurse told me that a snowplow driver found my truck on the highway and called it in, and that search and rescue teams had been looking for me since the next morning. They found my trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, followed them for about 4 miles along the road, and then tracked where I had wandered off into the open terrain. The footprints just stopped, she said, in the middle of a flat white field about 2 miles from the highway. No body, no sign of where I went after that. They searched for hours with dogs and helicopters, expanding the radius, checking every depression in the snow. A volunteer on a snowmobile finally spotted me nearly a mile from where my tracks ended, lying face down in a shallow ditch that had been invisible from the air. My core temperature when they got me to the medical center was 26 degrees Celsius. The doctors said anything below 28 is usually fatal, that most people do not come back from that. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right, plus the tips of 4 fingers. The surgeon told me I was lucky, and I wanted to laugh at him, but I did not have the energy. What I cannot stop thinking about even now is that gap between where my footprints stopped and where they found me. Almost a full mile of distance with no tracks, no trail, nothing to show how I got there. The rescue team leader visited me in the hospital and admitted he had never seen anything like it. The snow was undisturbed, fresh powder that would have shown every step, but there was just nothing, like I had been picked up and set down somewhere else. He asked if I remembered walking that distance, and I told him the truth, that I do not remember anything after falling that last time until I woke up in this bed. The doctors say it was probably some kind of automatic response, my body moving on its own while my conscious mind was completely shut down. A last survival instinct that kept me crawling toward that ditch where the wind was blocked and the snow provided insulation. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe my body saved itself while I was not home. But sometimes late at night, when I look at the stumps where my toes used to be and feel the phantom ache in my missing fingertips, I wonder about those invisible steps. I wonder what part of me was still walking when the rest of me had already given up. I drove through Alaska thinking I understood cold, thinking I was prepared, and I learned that there are things about your own body and your own mind that you will never understand, not even when they save your life. Seattle had given me everything I thought I wanted: a steady job at a busy clinic, a decent apartment, friends who understood the chaos of 12-hour shifts. But somewhere around my 10th year as a nurse practitioner, the routine started to feel like a slow suffocation. I needed something different, not just a change of scenery, but a complete reset. The kind you only get when you put 1,000 miles between yourself and everything familiar. When I saw the posting for a public health position in Koyukuk, a village of about 200 people in interior Alaska, something clicked. My nursing school classmates were buying houses in the suburbs, scheduling playdates, posting photos of their kitchen renovations. Meanwhile, I was signing a 2-year contract to work in a place most people could not find on a map. The salary was decent, housing was provided, and the job description mentioned everything from wellness checks to emergency response. My mother cried when I told her. My father just shook his head and asked if I had lost my mind. I arrived in Koyukuk on the last day of August, when the tundra was still gold and rust-colored, and the daylight stretched past 9 at night. A bush plane dropped me at a gravel airstrip about half a mile from the village center, and a man named Irving Tukala picked me up in a battered pickup truck that looked older than me. Irving worked for the tribal council and had been assigned to help me settle in. He was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of hard labor. He did not say much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks: the community center, the general store, the fuel depot. When we passed a cluster of houses set apart from the others, he slowed down slightly. "Moreau family," he said, his voice flat. "They keep to themselves." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Small towns always have their dynamics, their unspoken boundaries. I had no idea that those 3 words would become the first thread of something I wish I had never pulled. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. The health clinic was a small building with peeling paint and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, but it was functional. I saw patients for everything from ear infections to diabetes management, and most people were friendly in that reserved, cautious way that comes from living in tight-knit communities. I learned to read the silences as much as the words. A woman named Ruthie Anaktavuk became my unofficial guide to village life. She worked at the general store and had a way of explaining things without making me feel like an outsider. She told me which families had been there for generations, which had arrived more recently, and which ones I should just leave alone. When I asked about the Moreaus, her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. They handle their own problems, she said, and then she changed the subject to the weather forecast. I let it go, but something about her reaction stayed with me like a splinter I could not reach. It was mid-September when the first real incident happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came into the clinic with her mother. The girl had a gash on her forearm that clearly needed stitches, deep enough that I could see the white of tissue beneath the blood. But when I started preparing the suture kit, the mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her toward the door. "We changed our minds," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It will heal on its own." I tried to explain the risk of infection, the likelihood of scarring, but she was already gone. I stood there in the empty exam room holding a needle and thread, feeling like I had just witnessed something I did not understand. When I mentioned it to Ruthie later that day, she got very quiet. "That was Celeste Moreau," she finally said. "Her daughter Elise. They do not come to the clinic, they never have." I asked her why, and she just shook her head. "Some questions are better left alone out here." October came fast, and with it the cold. Not the crisp autumn chill I knew from the Pacific Northwest, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to seep into the walls, into your bones, into your thoughts. The daylight was shrinking rapidly, and by the end of the month we had maybe 6 hours of weak sunlight before the darkness swallowed everything again. I spent more time in the clinic going through old records, partly out of boredom, and partly because the incident with the Moreau girl kept nagging at me. The filing system was a mess, decades of paper records stuffed into cabinets with no real organization. But as I started sorting through them, patterns began to emerge. Death certificates mostly. In a village this small, you expect to see deaths from the usual causes: age, accidents, the occasional illness. What I did not expect was how many of those accidents involved the same handful of family names: Moreau, Ivanov, Tulik. Over and over again. Drownings, falls, exposure, hunting mishaps. All ruled accidental by whatever authority had signed off on them, but the frequency was staggering. In the past 15 years, I counted 11 deaths among those 3 families alone. 11, in a village of 200 people. I started making a list, writing down dates and names and causes of death on a yellow legal pad I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was just a city girl looking for drama in a quiet place. But then I noticed something else. The deaths were not random. They clustered around the same time each year, mostly between late October and early December, when the village was at its most isolated. When the rivers froze, but the ice was not yet thick enough for safe travel. When the bush planes stopped flying because of weather. When getting out of Koyukak became nearly impossible. I sat in my small clinic office with that legal pad in front of me, the wind howling outside, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was dying in this village almost every year, right around this time, and everyone was pretending it was normal. I made the mistake of asking questions. Not directly, not at first. I thought I was being subtle. I mentioned to Irving that I had been organizing the old records and noticed a lot of accidents over the years. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "Alaska is a dangerous place. People die." That was it. Conversation over. I tried a different approach with Ruthie, asking about the Ivanov and Tulik families, whether they were related to the Moreaus. She stopped stocking shelves and turned to face me with something in her eyes I had not seen before. Fear, maybe, or warning. "You are a good person," she said slowly. "You came here to help, so let me help you. Stop looking at those old papers. Stop asking about those families. Just do your job, get through the winter, and when spring comes you can decide if you want to stay or go. But right now you need to stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper by the end. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was genuinely afraid, and not for herself. That night I came home to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it. That was a habit from Seattle that I never broke. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped inside and turned on the light, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But my desk drawers were open, and the yellow legal pad where I had been keeping my notes was sitting in the middle of my bed. It had been in my clinic office. Someone had taken it, brought it here, and left it where I would be sure to find it. A message. I picked up the pad and flipped through it. All my notes were still there. Every name and date I had written down. But on the last page, someone had added a single sentence in handwriting that was not mine. "The winter is long and accidents happen." I stood there in my freezing cabin holding that legal pad, and for the first time since I arrived in Koyukuk, I felt truly afraid. Not curious, not unsettled, afraid. Because whoever wrote that note knew exactly what I had been doing, and they wanted me to know that they knew. I should have stopped. Any rational person would have stopped. But fear does strange things to you. Sometimes it paralyzes, and sometimes it pushes you to do exactly what you should not do. The next morning, I went to the tribal council office and asked to see the village census records from the past 20 years. The woman behind the desk, someone I had never spoken to before, looked at me like I had asked for the nuclear launch codes. She said the records were not available to outside contractors, that I would need special permission from the council elders. I asked how I could get that permission. She smiled without warmth and said the council only met once a month, and the next meeting was not until December. I walked out of that office knowing I had just put another target on my back. That afternoon, I tried to call my mother using the satellite phone at the community center, the only reliable way to reach the outside world. The phone was broken. It had worked fine the week before. The man who ran the center, a quiet guy named Amos Chukwu, said a part needed to be ordered and it would take a few weeks. He did not look at me when he said it. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The last supply plane came in on the 3rd, and the pilot told me the weather window was closing fast. He asked if I wanted to leave, said he could make room for one more passenger. I thought about it. I thought about the note on my bed, the broken satellite phone, the way people had started looking at me differently, like I was a problem that needed to be managed. But leaving felt like surrendering to something I did not understand, and some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. So I watched the plane take off and disappear into a gray sky, and I told myself I had made the right choice. By the middle of the month, the river was frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep in places. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40. The village became a small cluster of lights in an endless darkness, cut off from everything. And somewhere out there in one of those houses, people were waiting for something. I did not know what, not yet, but I was about to find out. It was November 19th when Ruthie came to my cabin after dark. She had never visited me at home before, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in white clouds, I knew something had changed. She pushed past me without waiting to be invited, and stood in the middle of my small living room, rubbing her hands together. "There is going to be an accident soon," she said, her voice tight. "The Moreaus owe a debt. They have owed it for 3 generations. The Ivanovs and the Tuliks, they owed debts too. That is how it works here. That is how it has always worked. I asked her what she meant by debt, and she told me a story that made everything click into a horrible place. Decades ago, before the village had any real connection to the outside world, the founding families made agreements with each other. Land rights, hunting territories, marriages, resources. When someone broke an agreement or wronged another family, there was a price. Not money, not property, blood. A life for a life passed down through generations until the debt was paid. It sounded insane, like something out of a history book about feudal societies. But Ruthie was not joking, and the fear in her eyes was absolutely real. She told me that the Moreau family had one more death owed to the Chukwu family, a wrong committed by someone's great-grandfather that had never been settled. This year, the debt was being called in. Elise, the little girl I had tried to help in September, was the one they had chosen. That was why her mother refused medical treatment. In their minds, there was no point in healing someone who was already marked. I felt sick. I asked Ruthie why she was telling me this, why now, and she said it was because I was the only person in the village who might actually do something. Everyone else had grown up with this system. They accepted it the way you accept gravity, not because it was right, but because it had always been there. Outsiders were usually discouraged from staying long enough to notice anything. But I had noticed, and I had kept asking questions, and now I was the only wild card in a game that had been playing out for generations. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, thinking through my options. Running was not possible. The snow was too deep, the cold too extreme, and the nearest town was over 60 miles away through wilderness. The satellite phone was still broken. I had no way to contact anyone outside, but I had something else: the clinic. Medical supplies, locked cabinets, and most importantly, a shortwave radio that I had seen in the back storage room during my first week. It was old and covered in dust, probably left over from the 80s, but it might still work. Before dawn, I walked to the clinic through knee-deep snow, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The radio was exactly where I remembered it. Took me almost an hour to figure out how to operate it, my fingers numb and clumsy. But finally I managed to reach a state trooper station in Fairbanks. I told them everything: the pattern of deaths, the threats, the little girl who was in danger. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical at first, but something in my voice must have convinced him, because he said he would send a team as soon as the weather cleared. He told me to stay inside, keep my head down, and wait. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed in the clinic, sleeping on the exam table, eating canned food from the emergency supplies. On the second day, someone tried the door handle in the middle of the night. It was locked, and whoever it was eventually went away. But I did not close my eyes again until morning. On the fourth day, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the frozen air. 2 state troopers and a child welfare officer landed on the outskirts of the village, and within hours, Elise Moreau was in protective custody. I do not know exactly what happened after that. I was evacuated on the same helicopter and never went back. I heard later that several people were arrested, that the investigation uncovered evidence of at least 7 deaths that were being reclassified as homicides. The village of Koyukak was all over the news for a few weeks, and then the world moved on to other horrors. I still have the yellow legal pad with the threat written on the last page. Sometimes I take it out and look at that handwriting, and I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they are still out there in some other small place keeping old debts alive. And I wonder how many other villages exist where the winter is long and accidents happen and nobody asks why. Working at a temporary construction camp in Alaska felt like a strange pause in my life, something I told myself was just a means to an end. I'd taken the job because the pay was good, and I needed to clear some debts, and the camp promised short rotations and long stretches of time off. At that point, my life was simple and quiet, mostly work, sleep, and the occasional call home when the satellite signal cooperated. The camp itself sat far from any real town, surrounded by uneven ground, frozen mud, and a horizon that never felt close. Rows of portable trailers were bolted into the dirt like they might slide away if no one watched them. Most of us were strangers to each other, passing through, carrying our own reasons for being there. That made it easy to keep your head down and mind your business. It also made it easy for things to happen without anyone asking too many questions. The day everything started to bother me wasn't dramatic at first, just oddly quiet. A guy named Trevor, who bunked 2 trailers down from me, didn't show up for breakfast. No note, no warning, just his locker cleared out and his boots gone. People said he'd quit overnight, which wasn't unheard of, but the way everyone accepted it felt rehearsed. This wasn't the first time either. Over the previous months, workers had vanished from the schedule between shifts. No goodbye drinks, no heated arguments with supervisors, nothing you'd expect from someone leaving suddenly. Management always brushed it off as personal issues or better offers elsewhere. The explanations were thin, but nobody pushed back. In a place like that, asking questions made you stand out. That night I worked the late shift, doing equipment checks near the edge of the camp where the lights barely reached. The generators hummed unevenly, and the cold crept through my gloves no matter how tightly I clenched my fingers. Somewhere past the trailers, I heard raised voices, low and sharp, like an argument being swallowed by the wind. I couldn't see who it was, only the outline of someone moving between structures, staying close to the shadows. When I walked closer, the voices stopped instantly, leaving behind an empty stretch of gravel and a feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Later, in the break room, a newer worker named Eli sat staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He clocked out early and didn't come back. By the next morning, Eli's trailer was locked and stripped bare, same as Trevor's. This time, though, I noticed scuff marks near the steps, deep grooves in the mud that looked like someone had been dragged or pushed hard. I brought it up quietly to a supervisor, who gave me a tight look and told me to focus on my job. That response stuck with me more than the marks themselves. Over lunch, a few of us traded glances but kept our mouths shut, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Everyone sensed there was something ugly underneath these disappearances. The camp's isolation made it feel like its own world, one where rules bent easily and consequences stayed far away. By the end of that morning, I realized the problem wasn't just people leaving. It was what might have been happening to them before they did. After that, I started paying closer attention to the little things people usually ignored. Conversations would stop when certain footsteps passed by the trailers. A few workers flinched at raised voices, even when it was just joking around. One night during dinner, I noticed bruising along the neck of a guy named Marcus, half hidden by his jacket collar. When I asked if he was okay, he forced a laugh and said he'd slipped on ice. The explanation didn't match the marks, which were too narrow and uneven. He left camp 2 days later without collecting his last paycheck. Management posted his position as open before his bunk was even cleaned out. It felt like the camp itself swallowed people whole, erased them, and moved on. The tension peaked during a night shift when one of the welders, Aaron, failed to check in at the end of his rotation. His radio crackled with static when we tried to reach him, and the supervisor delayed organizing a search, insisting Aaron probably wandered off to cool down somewhere. That excuse made no sense in freezing conditions, especially with the terrain around us. When we finally went looking, we found his helmet near a storage container, dented and smeared with dark residue. No blood trail, no signs of a fall, just silence and the wind dragging loose plastic against metal. By morning, Aaron was officially listed as having quit mid-shift. Seeing that typed out on the board felt unreal, like watching someone rewrite reality. A few days later, investigators arrived after someone finally contacted authorities outside the camp. They spoke to us one by one in a makeshift office, asking careful questions about threats, fights, and people leaving suddenly. What surprised me was how similar everyone's stories were once they felt safe talking. Intimidation in dark hallways, warnings delivered in whispers, physical confrontations that were never reported. One name kept surfacing, always followed by nervous pauses. The camp's setup made it easy for one person to control space and information, especially with new workers rotating in constantly. Oversight was minimal, records sloppy, and complaints quietly buried. Listening to it all laid out made me realize this wasn't a series of bad coincidences. The investigation uncovered years of ignored reports and unofficial settlements, all designed to keep the project running without disruption. The person responsible had learned exactly how far they could go, without triggering intervention, exploiting isolation and fear like tools. Workers who resisted were pressured into leaving, while others stayed silent to protect their paychecks. Eventually, the suspect was removed from the site under guard, though details were never fully shared with us. The camp didn't shut down, it just adjusted, pretending the problem had been solved cleanly. Even after things returned to a surface-level normal, the atmosphere never recovered. Every sound after dark carried weight, and trust between co-workers felt permanently damaged. I stayed long enough to see the investigators leave and the company issue a short statement about improved safety protocols. Nothing about the people who vanished, nothing about Aaron, nothing about the fear that had settled into the camp like a second climate. A few trailers were moved, a new supervisor rotated in, and we were told to report anything unusual. The words sounded empty by then. At night, the camp still felt watched, even with extra lighting and new faces around. People avoided being alone after dark, pairing up for cigarette breaks or bathroom runs. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, broken by every sound of metal shifting or boots crunching outside. The place had learned our routines, and we couldn't unlearn what it had shown us. The day I decided to leave came quietly, without drama. I packed my duffel in the early morning, hands moving on instinct while my mind replayed small moments I hadn't questioned before. The way certain doors were always locked, the lack of cameras near storage areas, the silence from management when complaints surfaced. None of it felt accidental anymore. I turned in my badge without explaining myself, and no one asked why. That part disturbed me the most. It was as if the camp expected departures, accepted them as part of its design. When the transport truck pulled away, I watched the trailers shrink into the distance, lined up neatly like they hadn't held anything terrible inside them. Months later, back in normal life, the memories still surface at odd times. A generator hum can pull me right back to those nights, or the smell of diesel mixed with cold air. I read about similar camps online, and see the same patterns repeated in different places. Temporary jobs, isolated locations, workers who pass through without roots. It creates gaps where accountability should be, and those gaps invite the wrong kind of people. I don't know what ultimately happened to everyone who disappeared. Some may have escaped before things got worse, others might not have been so lucky. That uncertainty is harder to live with than a clear answer. I'm sharing this here because places like that don't advertise their dangers. They sell opportunity, fast money, and the idea that you can endure anything for a short time. What I learned is that isolation changes the rules, and silence can be trained into people without them noticing. If you ever find yourself somewhere remote where people vanish quietly and no one wants to talk about it, pay attention. Leaving without explanation might look strange from the outside, but sometimes it's the only option left. I walked away with my life and a story that still doesn't sit right. Others didn't even get that much. At that point in my life, I was drifting between seasonal jobs, chasing contracts the way some people chase weather. Alaska felt like the right kind of distance. I was in my late 20s, traveling alone, working temporary gigs wherever someone needed an extra pair of hands before winter shut everything down. I didn't have much tying me anywhere, just a packed car, a notebook with phone numbers, and a habit of trusting my own planning a little too much. That morning started like dozens of others on the road. Cheap coffee, stiff muscles, and a long stretch of highway waiting ahead. I remember thinking that if I could reach the next town before dark, everything would stay on schedule. The light was already thinner than I liked, stretched low and pale across the road. Still, nothing about the day felt dramatic or unusual. It felt routine, and that's what makes it hard to explain now. The roadside stop sat alone against miles of nothing. A squat building with buzzing fluorescent lights, and a parking lot chewed up by gravel. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old fryer oil, the kind that sticks to your clothes. The woman behind the counter had tired eyes and kept glancing at the clock on the wall, tapping her pen like she was counting down to freedom. I told her I was heading toward the next town and expected to be there before nightfall. She gave me a look that lingered a second too long, then said something vague about the road being quiet lately. There was a corkboard near the door with handwritten notes for rides, missing dogs, odd local ads. One of the papers had been torn halfway down, as if someone changed their mind mid-sentence. I paid, thanked her, and walked back outside with that image still stuck in my head. The drive after that felt different, though nothing obvious had changed. The highway narrowed and twisted, the trees pressing closer, swallowing sound. Radio stations dissolved into static, then vanished altogether, leaving only the low hum of the engine. I noticed a vehicle behind me for a while, dark-colored, hard to pin down, but it never got close enough for me to read anything useful. When it finally disappeared, the absence felt louder than its presence had. I kept checking the dashboard clock, doing mental math about distance and fading daylight. The sky was slipping toward that heavy blue-gray that comes fast in remote places. I told myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Being alone that long messes with your head. Or at least that's what I believed then. The last clear memory I have of that stretch comes from pulling over near a wide shoulder, thinking I should double-check my map before continuing. The engine cut, and the silence rushed in immediately, thick and pressing. My keys weren't in the cup holder where I always dropped them, which struck me as odd enough to make my chest tighten. I searched the seats, the floor, the console, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That's when I noticed how untouched everything else was. My bag still zipped, jacket folded the way I'd left it. No sign that anyone had been inside the car. The road was empty in both directions, stretching endlessly, offering no clues and no comfort. Standing there, surrounded by wilderness that didn't care whether I existed or not, I understood how easy it would be for someone to vanish without a sound. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly small decisions start stacking up when you're isolated. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind scrape through the brush and feeling watched without seeing anyone. After a while, I noticed impressions in the gravel that didn't match my tires, faint but fresh, angled as if another vehicle had stopped nearby and then rolled on. It bothered me enough to make me scan the tree line, counting breaths, telling myself to stay calm and practical. I locked the car out of habit even though I couldn't find the keys, and that contradiction made my head spin. The light kept thinning, draining color from everything, and the idea of waiting there suddenly felt reckless. I decided to walk a short distance down the highway, thinking maybe the keys had fallen when I stepped out. That choice still echoes in my mind. The road felt longer on foot, every sound magnified by the emptiness. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud enough to make me wince. After a few minutes, I heard an engine somewhere behind me, slow and steady, not rushing. I moved closer to the shoulder, rehearsing what I'd say if someone stopped, friendly but guarded, grateful but not desperate. The vehicle passed without slowing, close enough that I caught a glimpse of the driver's profile. Eyes forward, jaw tight, both hands high on the wheel. No wave, no acknowledgement. The wind carried the smell of exhaust for a moment, then swallowed it. That was when the reality of my situation settled in fully. Night was coming fast, and I was suddenly very alone. I turned back toward my car, faster now, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't neatly explain. The sky had deepened into a dull, bruised color, and the forest on either side looked denser than before, like it had crept closer while I wasn't looking. When I reached the spot where I'd left the car, my stomach clenched, not from panic, but from disbelief. The car was still there exactly as I'd left it, but the driver's door stood open a few inches. Inside, nothing was disturbed. No broken glass, no mess, no obvious signs of interference. Just the quiet and the open door, waiting. I shut it slowly, every sense tuned tight, trying to decide whether staying or leaving on foot made more sense. I spent that night inside the car, curled up low, conserving heat and listening to every shift in the air. At some point, footsteps passed nearby, careful and measured, stopping just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint them. No voice, no flashlight beam, no sudden movement, just the unmistakable sound of someone standing there, deciding something. Eventually, the steps retreated, dissolving back into the dark. When morning finally came, gray and weak, the keys were sitting on the hood, neatly placed as if to be found. I didn't question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I reached a town with people and noise and walls. I reported what happened, and searches were done, but nothing else turned up. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know that the isolation didn't protect me. It exposed me. After I reached that town, everything moved fast in a way that felt unreal. People asked questions while handing me coffee, while filling out forms, while glancing at each other when I described the open door and the keys on the hood. They focused on timelines, directions, mile markers. I kept trying to explain the feeling of being evaluated out there, like someone had been testing how far they could push before I broke. Search teams went back along the highway before the light faded again, combing ditches and tree lines, marking spots with little flags. I watched from the edge of the road, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, feeling strangely detached from my own story. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't have the words to disagree. As the day stretched on, the questions shifted. Had I noticed anyone at the roadside stop? Did anyone seem too interested in my plans? I mentioned the board with the torn paper, the look the woman gave me when I talked about reaching town before night. One of the officers exchanged a glance with another and wrote something down without comment. They asked if I'd heard rumors about people disappearing along that route. I hadn't, but the way they phrased it told me enough. The wilderness wasn't just empty, it was useful. Miles of road, few witnesses, long delays before anyone noticed something was wrong. Anyone patient enough could wait out there and never leave a trace. By evening, they told me there was nothing more to do until morning. I sat alone in a small room at a motel, staring at my phone, replaying every choice I'd made since sunrise. I realized how close I'd come to doing exactly what I said at the counter, pushing forward until dark, trusting the road to take care of me. If I hadn't stopped when I did, if I'd ignored that missing key moment, the story might have ended very differently. The thought didn't come with dramatic fear, just a dull, heavy certainty. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They wait quietly for you to be tired enough to make them. I left Alaska not long after that. I finished the contract I was there for, but the rest of the trip felt hollow, like I was moving through someone else's life. I still think about that stretch of highway and how calm everything looked on the surface. People ask if I believe someone was responsible, or if it was just coincidence and bad luck brushing up against isolation. I don't argue either way. All I know is that the road gave someone an opportunity, and that opportunity almost included me. When I tell this now, it's not for answers. It's so someone else might hesitate at a lonely stop and decide not to trust the distance the way I did. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. November always makes me think about that Thanksgiving when I drove up to my parents' place in Connecticut, radio playing oldies while autumn leaves swirled across the highway. I'd just gotten promoted at the publishing house where I worked, and for once I felt like I had good news to share at the family table. Mom had called 3 times that week to confirm I was coming, reminding me to bring my famous cornbread stuffing that everyone pretended to love. Dad was probably already stationed in his recliner, watching football with the volume too high, sneaking bites of whatever Mom had cooling on the counter. My sister Natalie would be there with her husband Tom and their twin boys, plus my brother Jason was flying in from Seattle with his girlfriend. Even cousin Beth promised to show up, though she had a habit of arriving fashionably late to everything since college. Our parents lived in one of those neighborhoods where every house had the same mailbox, and people actually cared about their lawn height, 40 minutes outside Hartford, in a town small enough that the grocery store clerk knew your birthday. Mom had been cooking since Tuesday, the kitchen windows fogged up from steam, her apron covered in flour and mysterious stains that she wore like battle scars. When I pulled into the driveway around 3 that afternoon, I could already smell the turkey through my car vents, that rich golden scent mixing with cinnamon and nutmeg from whatever pies were cooling inside. Natalie's minivan was parked crooked as always, and Jason's rental car sat beside it, still sporting an airport parking stub on the dash. Inside, the house buzzed with that special kind of chaos that only happens when family converges. Voices layered over each other, kids shrieking with joy, football announcers droning from the living room, and Mom orchestrating everything from her command post by the stove. Dinner was supposed to start at 5, but we all knew that meant 5:30 in Mom time, after she'd checked the turkey's temperature 4 more times and rearranged the table settings that were already perfect. Beth finally showed up around 4:30, breezing through the door with apologies about traffic and a store-bought pie that Mom would politely put on the dessert table next to her homemade ones. We were all catching up in the living room, Jason telling some story about turbulence on his flight, while Tom tried to keep the twins from destroying Mom's coffee table arrangement of ceramic pilgrim figurines she'd had since the 80s. Dad had dozed off in his chair, mouth slightly open, the remote balanced on his stomach, rising and falling with each breath. Everything felt exactly like it should, like every other year, comfortable and predictable in the best way possible. Around 5:15, just as Mom was calling everyone to help carry dishes to the dining room, the doorbell rang. We all kind of looked at each other because everyone was already here, and Mom hadn't mentioned inviting anyone else. Beth jumped up from the couch, saying something about how she forgot to mention she'd invited someone, her voice carrying that nervous pitch it got when she was covering for something. She hurried to the door before anyone could ask questions, and we heard her greeting someone warmly, though her laugh sounded forced, brittle around the edges. A moment later, she walked back in with this man, probably mid-30s, wearing a charcoal sweater over a white button-down, dark jeans, everything pressed and neat like he'd just stepped out of a catalog. He had one of those faces that was handsome in a forgettable way, brown hair trimmed short, clean-shaven, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street and never think about again. Beth introduced him as Kyle, and Mom, being Mom, immediately went into hostess mode, welcoming him and insisting he join us for dinner, saying there was plenty of food, which was true since she always cooked for an army. He shook hands with everyone, his grip firm but not trying to prove anything, smiled at the kids without that fake enthusiasm some adults put on, and complimented the house in this quiet, measured way. His voice had this particular quality, not quite monotone but close, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. Jason offered him a beer, which he politely declined, asking for water instead. Natalie was already setting another place at the table, and Tom was making small talk about the weather and asking how he knew Beth. Kyle's answers were perfectly normal but weirdly vague, saying they'd met through mutual friends, keeping everything surface level without seeming evasive. We all settled around the dining room table, Mom's good china gleaming under the chandelier she only turned on for special occasions, the turkey golden and magnificent as a centerpiece surrounded by every side dish known to mankind. Dad carved while we passed around mashed potatoes, Green bean casserole, cranberry sauce that still showed the ridges from the can, just how Dad liked it, and my stuffing that everyone took small portions of to be polite. Kyle sat between Beth and Jason, cutting his food into precise, identical pieces before eating, each bite deliberate and careful. He answered questions when asked, but never initiated conversation, and I noticed he kept glancing at the windows, quick little checks like he was timing something. The twins were getting restless, kicking table legs and whining about wanting pie already, while Natalie tried to bribe them with promises of extra whipped cream if they'd just eat 3 more bites of vegetables. That's when I saw it. Just a dark stain on his sleeve when he reached for the salt, spreading from under his cuff maybe 3 inches up his forearm. At first I thought maybe it was sauce or wine, but the color was wrong, too dark, almost black against the gray fabric, and it had that stiff quality fabric gets when something has dried into it. Without really thinking, I asked him what happened to his sweater, pointing at the stain, and the entire table went quiet in that abrupt way that makes your ears ring. Kyle looked down at his sleeve slowly, like he'd forgotten it was there, then pulled his arm back under the table. Beth started to say something about how clumsy he was, always spilling things, but her voice cracked and died halfway through the excuse. Mom was staring at the spot where his arm had been, her fork suspended between her plate and her mouth, gravy dripping onto the tablecloth she'd ironed that morning. Kyle stood up then, not quickly but with this terrible purposefulness, pushing his chair back with both hands, and I remember thinking how his fingernails were too clean, like he'd scrubbed them raw. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out something black and heavy-looking, and for a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing, because things like that didn't belong at Mom's Thanksgiving table next to the ceramic turkey salt shakers she'd owned since before I was born. Dad started to stand too, his napkin falling to the floor, saying something about calming down. "Let's talk about this." But Kyle pointed the gun at him without even looking, like it was an afterthought, and Dad sat back down hard enough to make the dishes jump. One of the twins started crying, that hitching, confused sob kids do when they don't understand why the adults are acting wrong, and Tom tried to pull both boys closer, but Kyle made this clicking sound with his tongue, just once, and Tom's hand stopped moving. He walked over to the dining room entrance, still holding the gun loose and comfortable like it weighed nothing, and turned the deadbolt with his free hand, the sound impossibly loud in the silence broken only by the child's whimpering and the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Then he moved to the windows, pulling the curtains closed one by one, taking his time like he had all night, and with each swoosh of fabric the room got smaller and darker despite the chandelier blazing overhead. When he turned back to us, his face had changed somehow, not the features but the way he wore them, like he'd finally stopped pretending to be human and let whatever was underneath show through. He told us to put our phones on the table, voice still calm and measured, and we did, our hands moving like we were underwater. Mom's case with the painted roses, Dad's ancient flip phone, everyone's devices making a little pile next to the boat of gravy that was still steaming. Beth was shaking so hard her chair creaked, tears running down her face and dripping onto her plate, mixing with the cranberry sauce into something that looked like diluted blood. Kyle noticed and walked behind her chair, placing his free hand on her shoulder, and she went completely rigid, like a rabbit when a hawk passes overhead. He said he hadn't expected everyone to be here, that this was supposed to be simpler, but that plans change and we adapt, all while his thumb moved in small circles on Beth's shoulder like he was comforting her. Jason carefully, slowly, asked what he wanted. Money, cars, whatever it was, we could figure it out. But Kyle just tilted his head like Jason had asked something in a foreign language. He said he'd been watching Beth for weeks, learning her schedule, her habits, waiting for the right moment. And Thanksgiving had seemed perfect because she'd be distracted, happy, guard down. Except she'd invited him inside herself, thinking he was someone from her yoga class who'd been flirting with her. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life, Kyle making us sit there while he ate his pie, gun resting next to his plate like another piece of silverware, occasionally picking it up to gesture when someone shifted too much or breathed too loud. He told us about following Beth home from the grocery store, sitting outside her apartment, how easy it was to duplicate her parking pass, slip into her building's gym when she worked out at the same time every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Mom tried to keep the twins calm, singing quietly under her breath, old lullabies from when we were little, while Dad's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't say. At some point, Tom's youngest threw up, fear and turkey mixing into something awful, and Kyle made Natalie clean it with Mom's good napkins while the rest of us watched. Nobody allowed to help or move or even look away. He went through our phones then, reading text messages out loud, showing us pictures from our own cameras, asking questions about people in the photos like we were having a normal conversation, like the gun wasn't right there, like Beth wasn't making these tiny wounded animal sounds every time he touched her hair. Around 8:30, Jason's girlfriend started moving her foot just slightly toward her purse on the floor, where I knew she kept pepper spray on her keychain because she'd shown it to me earlier, proud of the pink canister she'd bought after moving to the city. Kyle noticed immediately, of course he did, and very calmly shot the purse, the sound so loud in the dining room that my ears rang for 20 minutes after, the twins screaming, Mom pulling them against her even though Kyle had said not to move. The bullet went through the purse and into Mom's hardwood floor, leaving a hole that would never really get fixed, just covered with a rug that nobody would ever explain. He said the next one wouldn't be aimed at the floor, said it just like he was passing the butter, and Jason's girlfriend wet herself, the shame and terror on her face something I still see sometimes when I can't sleep. We sat there for another hour after that, nobody trying anything, until police sirens started getting closer, and Kyle stood up like he'd been waiting for them, walking to the back door that led to Mom's garden, telling us to count to 100 before moving. Nice and slow, out loud, together, and we did, our voices shaking through numbers while we heard his footsteps on the deck. Then nothing. The police found us still sitting at the table when they broke through the front door, Beth in complete shock, unable to speak for 3 days afterward. The rest of us trying to explain what happened while EMTs checked everyone, even though nobody was physically hurt except for bruises on Beth's shoulder, shaped like fingertips. Turns out Kyle wasn't even his real name, and the man they eventually caught 3 states over had been doing this for years, choosing women who lived alone, sometimes just watching them for months, sometimes breaking in. But we were the first family situation he'd attempted. The detective said we were lucky, that it could have gone much worse. But lucky isn't the word I'd use for what happened to us. Beth moved back home with our parents for 6 months. Couldn't be alone. Jumped whenever someone knocked on a door, and even now, years later, she won't go to yoga anymore. Won't go anywhere she might run into strangers who seem too friendly, too interested in her schedule. We still do Thanksgiving at Mom and Dad's house because Mom refused to let him take that from us. But it's different now, smaller, quieter. Everyone arriving together, leaving together, no strangers, no plus ones unless we've known them for years. And Dad installed 3 new deadbolts and a security system that he checks obsessively. The hole in the dining room floor is covered by a Persian rug Mom bought at an estate sale, and we all step around it carefully, like it might still be dangerous, like stepping on it might somehow bring him back. Sometimes during dinner I'll catch one of us staring at the chair where he sat, now pushed into the corner and used only to hold coats, and we'll make eye contact and look away quickly, the memory passing between us like a static shock. The twins don't remember much, which is a blessing, but Natalie says they still sometimes ask why everyone got so quiet that night, why Aunt Beth was so sad, why we had to count to 100, and she tells them it was just a game, just a silly adult game that went too long. And they believe her because they were young enough that their minds protected them from the worst of it, rewrote the story into something softer, safer, something that couldn't follow them into their dreams. My therapist had been pushing me for months to reach out to my siblings, but sending those Thanksgiving invitation emails felt like swallowing broken glass. 5 years we'd gone without speaking. all because of some stupid fight over Dad's estate that spiraled into something uglier than any of us intended. Carolyn and Bradley had been my best friends once, before lawyers and appraisals and old resentments turned us into strangers. Sitting in my kitchen that October afternoon, I stared at my laptop screen for 20 minutes before finally hitting send on both messages. 2 days later, when Carolyn replied with a simple, "We'll be there," followed by Bradley's "Count me in," I had to lock myself in the bathroom at work to pull myself together. 37 years on this planet, and I was crying in a bathroom stall over a 2-word email. By Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, my dining room looked like a food magazine threw up in it. I'd spent nearly $300 at Whole Foods, another $100 at Trader Joe's, and even drove 40 minutes to this specialty shop in Westchester for some fancy butter from France that supposedly made everything taste better. Every single item still sealed in its original packaging, laid out on my counter like evidence in a crime scene. The 22-pound turkey from that organic farm upstate, the pre-made sides with their tamper-proof seals, even the pies came in those rigid plastic containers you need scissors to open. Carolyn was bringing her husband Mark and their daughter Ashley, who I hadn't seen since she was 9 and missing her front teeth. Bradley would come alone, his divorce papers barely 2 months old, probably dreading the questions everyone would carefully not ask. Thanksgiving morning arrived with one of those crisp blue skies that made you grateful to be alive, and I was up at 6, too anxious to sleep any longer. The turkey went into the oven first, still in its original packaging until the very last second when I transferred it to the roasting pan. I actually took a photo of the sealed package before opening it, some paranoid part of me wanting proof that everything started out fine. The kitchen filled with that gorgeous smell of roasting bird and herbs, and for a few hours, I let myself believe this would work. I kept checking my phone, waiting for last-minute cancellations, but the family group chat stayed quiet, except for Carolyn sending a thumbs-up emoji when I texted that dinner would be at 4 sharp. They arrived within minutes of each other, which felt staged somehow, like they'd coordinated in the driveway to avoid any awkward one-on-one time. Ashley had grown into this stunning young woman with her mother's cheekbones and her father's quiet confidence, giving me a genuine hug that nearly broke me all over again. Bradley looked thinner, worn down in that specific way divorce carves into people, but he brought flowers, yellow roses like Mom used to grow. We all danced around the elephant in the room with remarkable skill, talking about traffic and weather, and Ashley's college applications, while I ferried dishes from kitchen to dining room. Mark helped carve the turkey, making some joke about his surgical precision from years of fishing, and for about 30 beautiful minutes, we felt like a family again. We were halfway through the meal when Carolyn's fork clattered onto her plate. She pressed her hand against her chest, her face draining of color so fast it looked like someone was adjusting the contrast on a TV screen. Mark was asking if she was okay when she pitched forward, her face nearly landing in the mashed potatoes before he caught her shoulders. Ashley screamed, that sharp teenage pitch that cuts through everything, and I was already reaching for my phone when Bradley made this horrible gasping sound. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, clutching at his throat like something was stuck, but nothing was there. His eyes locked on mine for one terrible second, confused and terrified, before his knees buckled and he went down hard, taking half the tablecloth with him. Everything after that moved in weird, jerky segments, like a movie with missing frames. Mark on the floor doing CPR compressions on Carolyn, while Ashley counted out loud between sobs. Me trying to explain to the 911 operator that 2 people had collapsed at dinner. No known allergies. Yes, they're both breathing, but barely. The turkey sitting there on its silver platter, looking obscene and wrong while my brother writhed on my dining room floor. I remember noticing the stupidest details, like how Bradley's wine had spilled in a perfect arc across my grandmother's white tablecloth, like how one of the candles kept flickering even though nobody was moving near it. The paramedics arrived in 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours, and suddenly my house was full of strangers in uniforms, radios crackling, medical terms I didn't understand bouncing off the walls. At the hospital, they separated us immediately. Carolyn and Bradley went straight to the ICU, while the rest of us got shuffled into different exam rooms for blood tests and questioning. A doctor with exhausted eyes and day-old stubble explained that both my siblings showed signs of acute poisoning, something called tetrodotoxin, which made no sense because that comes from pufferfish, and we definitely hadn't eaten any exotic seafood. The police showed up while nurses were drawing my blood for the third time, 2 detectives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Thanksgiving night. They bagged up my phone after I showed them the photo of the sealed turkey package, asked me to write down every single thing we'd eaten, where I'd bought it, who had access to my house. Mark kept Ashley pressed against his side while she shook, both of them testing negative for any toxins just like me. The detective, a woman named Ramirez with silver streaking through her black hair, drove me back to my house around midnight to collect the food evidence. My dining room looked like a scene from those true crime shows Ashley was always watching. Abandoned plates with half-eaten food, Bradley's chair still tipped over, that wine stain already setting into the fabric. We went through my kitchen with gloves on, bagging up every leftover, every package from the trash, even the empty containers I'd already rinsed. Ramirez found the turkey packaging in my recycling bin, held it up to the light from her phone, and that's when we both saw it, a tiny hole near the bottom corner, so small you'd never notice unless you were looking. She sealed it in an evidence bag, her face carefully neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten. Someone had injected poison through the packaging, which meant someone had been in the store, targeting that specific turkey, knowing I would buy it. They kept me at the station until 4 in the morning, going over the same questions until my voice went hoarse. Who knew about the dinner? Who knew where I shopped? Had I noticed anyone following me lately? Did my siblings have enemies? Did I have enemies? The fluorescent lights made everything feel unreal, like I was floating above myself watching some other woman in a food-stained blouse trying to explain that no, she couldn't think of anyone who'd want to hurt her family. Ramirez had store security footage pulled from the Whole Foods, 3 days of recordings to comb through, looking for someone tampering with the turkey section. They asked about my ex-husband, but David lived in Oregon now with his new family and hadn't contacted me in years. They asked about work conflicts, but I processed insurance claims for a living, boring stuff that never involved anything worth killing over. I stayed at a hotel that night because I couldn't face going home to that dining room battlefield. Didn't sleep, just sat in the uncomfortable chair by the window watching occasional cars pass on the empty street below, checking my phone every few minutes for updates from the hospital. Carolyn was stable, but still unconscious, machines breathing for her. Bradley had come around briefly, couldn't speak yet but squeezed the nurse's hand when asked if he could hear her. The hotel room smelled like old cigarette smoke painted over with industrial air freshener, and I kept replaying the dinner in my head, looking for signs I'd missed. Had anyone been watching the house when they arrived? Was there something strange about how quickly everyone got sick? Why only Carolyn and Bradley when we all ate the same food? Around 6 in the morning, I gave up pretending to rest and drove to the hospital, where Mark was sleeping across 3 waiting room chairs with Ashley curled against him like she was 5 years old again. Ramirez called while I was getting terrible coffee from the hospital vending machine, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify. She needed me to come back to my house immediately. Wouldn't say why over the phone, just that there had been a development. The drive felt endless even though it was only 15 minutes, my brain spinning through possibilities, none of them good. When I pulled up, there were 2 more police cars in my driveway, and a uniformed officer was stringing yellow tape across my porch steps. Ramirez met me on the sidewalk, holding an evidence bag with something white inside, and her first words made my knees wobble. They'd found a note, she said, tucked under my doormat where it must have been placed sometime during the night, while I was at the hotel. Computer printed on plain paper, just one line that made everything infinitely worse. You should have never invited them. The investigation exploded after that, federal agents joining because of the tetrodotoxin, which apparently flagged some database as a potential bioweapon. They interviewed everyone from my past, pulled apart 5 years of grievances and hurt feelings, looking for someone angry enough about our reconciliation to do this. The security footage showed a figure in a baseball cap and medical mask near the turkey section 3 different times, but never a clear face, like they knew exactly where the cameras were. Both my siblings survived, though Carolyn has permanent nerve damage in her left hand, and Bradley still gets seizures that the doctors say might never stop. We never found out who did it, though Ramirez had a theory she shared with me months later, off the record, about someone who'd benefited from our family staying broken, someone who'd inserted themselves into our lives during those 5 years apart. She wouldn't give me a name, said she couldn't prove it, but the way she looked at me when she said it made me think of Mark's cousin Glenn, who'd been handling Bradley's divorce, who'd been so insistent that family reunions never went well, who'd mysteriously left town the day after Thanksgiving for a job opportunity in Vancouver that nobody had heard about before. The strangest part came 6 months later, when I was finally cleaning out that dining room properly, pulling up the ruined carpet where the wine had soaked through. Underneath, wedged between 2 floorboards, I found a USB drive that definitely hadn't been there when we renovated 3 years earlier. My whole body went cold when I plugged it in and found a single video file, timestamped from the morning of Thanksgiving. It showed my kitchen, filmed from an angle that meant someone had been inside my house, had installed a camera somewhere I never found. In the video, you could see me preparing everything, but more importantly, you could see someone else, someone in dark clothes and a ski mask entering through my back door with a key I didn't know existed. They went straight to my refrigerator, knew exactly which turkey was mine, and spent less than 30 seconds injecting something through the packaging before leaving. The figure's height, build, the way they moved, it was definitely a woman, and she had a distinctive scar on her right hand that looked fresh, maybe 6 months old. I gave the USB to Ramirez immediately, and within hours, they'd arrested Glenn's girlfriend, a woman named Veronica who'd been a lab technician at a pharmaceutical company until she got fired the previous year for stealing controlled substances. Turns out Glenn had been skimming money from Bradley's divorce settlement, nearly $40,000, and when he heard about our Thanksgiving reunion, he panicked that we'd compare notes and figure it out. Veronica confessed to everything in exchange for a plea deal, 25 years instead of life. She'd been promised half the money Glenn had stolen, thought she was just going to make everyone sick enough to ruin the dinner, claimed she didn't know the dose would be nearly fatal. Glenn got 40 years, no parole. The prosecutors said he'd been planning it since October, the moment I'd sent those invitation emails. He'd installed that camera during a friendly visit to check on me, copied my spare key, tracked my shopping patterns through my credit card statements he could access through the divorce proceedings. The USB drive was Veronica's insurance policy, hidden in my house in case Glenn tried to pin everything on her. These days, Carolyn and Bradley and I have dinner together every Sunday, no exceptions. Always at restaurants where we can see the kitchen, always ordering different dishes, never sharing food. We don't talk about that Thanksgiving anymore, but we also don't let each other out of sight for very long. And honestly, that's the only good thing that came from almost losing everything. We remembered that staying angry is a luxury you can only afford when you're certain you'll have another chance to make things right. Mom called me 3 times that week, reminding me about Thanksgiving dinner like I might somehow forget, after 36 years of showing up at the same split-level house in Michigan. Since the divorce papers were finalized in September, she'd been extra persistent about family gatherings, probably worried I'd spend the holiday eating Chinese takeout in my studio apartment. Dad had retired from the auto plant earlier that year, and according to Mom, he'd been drinking his way through retirement, tinkering in his workshop on projects nobody asked for, mostly birdhouses that cluttered the garage shelves. Uncle Frank would be there, of course, Dad's younger brother who owned a plumbing company 2 towns over, and never missed a chance to drink Dad's beer while complaining about millennials ruining the trades. Pulling into the driveway that afternoon, I noticed the Lions flag on the porch had faded to almost pink, And through the kitchen window, steam from Mom's cooking fogged the glass, same as every year since I could remember. Dad answered the door holding a Coors Light, his third or fourth judging by how he gripped the door frame for balance, and Uncle Frank's laugh boomed from the living room where the parade flickered on TV. My sister Amanda had already claimed the kitchen with Mom, her husband Steve chasing their twin boys around the coffee table while they shrieked and threw couch pillows at each other. Amanda shot me a look that said she'd been dealing with this chaos all morning, stirring gravy while Mom basted the turkey for the 100th time, both of them moving around each other with practiced efficiency. The house smelled exactly like childhood, sage and butter, and that specific brand of coffee Mom only bought for holidays. And I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settling into the worn spot on the couch while Dad and Frank argued about whether Detroit would make the playoffs. Steve finally corralled the twins with promises of pie later, and we all migrated to the dining room table, where Mom had set out the good china she inherited from Grandma, the plates with tiny painted roses around the edges. Halfway through dinner, right when Steve was telling some story about a client who tried to pay him in cryptocurrency, Dad pushed back from the table and mumbled something about needing more beer from the garage. Uncle Frank followed him, which seemed weird since Frank still had half a Budweiser next to his plate, but nobody else appeared to notice, too busy laughing at Steve's impression of the crypto guy explaining blockchain. The twins were flinging mashed potatoes at each other with their spoons, and Amanda had given up trying to stop them, just holding her wine glass away from the splash zone while Mom pretended not to see the mess accumulating on her carpet. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear Dad and Frank's voices low at first, the clink of bottles then gradually getting louder, though I couldn't make out the words over Steve's story and the kids giggling. Mom kept glancing toward the kitchen, her smile tightening around the edges, and she started cutting her turkey into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of them. Their voices in the kitchen shifted from conversation to something sharper, Dad's words slurring together while Frank's tone turned hard and insistent. Steve had stopped talking mid-sentence about Bitcoin wallets, and even the twins went quiet, potato-covered spoons suspended in mid-air as we all turned toward the kitchen. Mom set down her fork carefully like she was defusing a bomb, and started to stand when Frank's voice cut through clear as breaking glass. "You think they'll never find out what you did to him?" The silence that followed felt physical, pressing against my eardrums, and Dad stumbled back into the dining room, his face the color of old newspaper, while Frank stood in the doorway behind him, fists clenched at his sides. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and I watched a drop of gravy slide down the wall where one of the twins had flung it earlier, the only movement in a room that suddenly felt too small and too hot. "What did you just say?" Amanda's voice came out strangled, and she was staring at Dad like she'd never seen him before, while Steve pulled the twins closer to him on the bench. Dad's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and he reached for the back of his chair, missing it on the first try. Frank stepped into the dining room, and I noticed his work boots left mud prints on Mom's white carpet, these dark smudges that seemed important somehow, like evidence at a crime scene. "Go ahead, Bill, tell them," Frank said, his voice steady now, controlled, nothing like the drunk rambling from earlier. "Tell them about the Brennan kid, about what really happened that summer." Mom made this sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, and her hand went to her throat where she always touched her pearl necklace when she was nervous, except she wasn't wearing it today. Just an empty space where it should have been. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out raw and desperate. "Frank, you're drunk, you don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes kept darting around the room, landing on everything except our faces. The Brennan kid, I remembered him vaguely. Christopher Brennan, who lived 3 streets over and disappeared the summer I turned 10. Search parties combing the woods behind the elementary school. His picture on every telephone pole for months until the rain washed them away. Frank laughed, but it sounded bitter, poisonous. "Drunk, maybe, but not drunk enough to keep pretending, not after what I saw you burning in that barrel last week. Those things you thought nobody would find." Ooh, the twins started crying. That confused, scared cry kids do when they know something bad is happening but can't understand what. and Steve was already standing, pulling them toward the door while Amanda grabbed their coats from the hall closet, her movements sharp and automatic like she was on autopilot. "Everyone just calm down," Mom said, but her voice cracked on the last word, and she was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles looked like white marbles under her skin. Frank shook his head, disgust written across his face. "No, I'm done being calm, done keeping your secrets, Bill. 26 years I've carried this. Watched you play the grieving neighbor when that family put up posters. Watched you at church praying like you weren't the reason that boy never came home." Dad lunged at Frank then, this clumsy, desperate swing that Frank easily stepped away from, and Dad crashed into the china cabinet, Mom's good plates rattling on their stands. I stood up, not sure whether to help Dad or stop him, but my legs felt disconnected from my body, like I was watching everything through frosted glass. Amanda had already left with Steve and the kids, the front door hanging open, cold November air rushing in and mixing with the smell of abandoned turkey and spilled wine. Mom was crying now, these quiet, steady tears that ran down her face while she stood perfectly still, and I realized she wasn't surprised, not really, just defeated, like she'd been waiting for this moment for decades. "The attic," Frank said, looking directly at me now, ignoring Dad who was slumped against the cabinet. "Check the attic, behind the Christmas decorations, in that old steamer trunk he thinks nobody remembers. He couldn't bring himself to destroy everything." Dad made this wounded animal sound and tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, and he slid down to sit on the floor, his back against the cabinet, head in his hands. Frank walked past him toward the door, pausing to look back at Mom. "I'm sorry, Diane, but I couldn't watch him teach those twins how to fish in the same spot anymore. Couldn't pretend." Then he was gone, and it was just the three of us in that dining room that suddenly felt like a crime scene. The good china still set out like props in a play nobody wanted to finish. I don't remember making the decision to go upstairs, but suddenly I was pulling down the attic ladder, the hinges screaming in protest like they always did, that sound that used to terrify me as a kid because I thought it was ghosts. Mom had followed me, moving like a sleepwalker, while Dad stayed downstairs and I could hear him mumbling to himself, the words blurred and meaningless. The attic smelled like mothballs and old insulation, that thick, dusty air that coats your throat, and I had to duck under the beams using my phone's flashlight to navigate past boxes labeled in Mom's neat handwriting. Baby clothes, wedding, school papers. Behind the tower of Christmas decoration boxes, covered in a thick layer of dust, sat the steamer trunk Frank had mentioned, its leather straps cracked with age, the brass buckles green with tarnish. The lock had been broken years ago, probably before I was born, and the lid opened with a soft groan that seemed too loud in the cramped space. Inside, underneath a moldy blanket that fell apart when I touched it, I found them. A child's sneaker, just one, the red stripes faded to pink, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles wallet with $3 still inside, and at the bottom, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, a newspaper from July 1998. The headline read, "Local boy missing for third day, search continues." And there was Christopher Brennan's school photo, that gap-toothed smile every third grader had, his hair sticking up in the back despite what was probably his mother's best efforts with a comb. But it was what lay beneath the newspaper that made my chest tighten. Dad's work shirt from the plant, the one with his name embroidered on the pocket, stained with something dark that had turned rust-colored over the years, and caught in the fabric, several strands of hair, lighter than Dad's, lighter than anyone's in our family. Mom stood behind me, her breathing shallow and quick, and when I turned to look at her, she seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes, her face gray in the dim light from my phone. "I always wondered," she whispered, and it wasn't clear if she was talking to me or herself, why he insisted on moving Christopher's bike from the garage to the shed that night, why he spent hours cleaning his truck when it wasn't even dirty. She reached past me and picked up the wallet, turning it over in her hands like it might dissolve, and I saw her shoulders start to shake. Frank tried to tell me something was wrong back then, but I didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe that the man I married, the father of my children. She trailed off. unable to finish the thought. We could hear sirens in the distance getting closer, and I realized Frank must have called them after he left. Must have finally decided that 26 years of silence was enough. I helped Mom down from the attic, both of us moving like we were underwater, every step requiring enormous effort. Dad was gone from the dining room, but his car keys still sat on the counter, so he couldn't have gotten far. Probably hiding in his workshop with those stupid birdhouses, surrounded by the tools he'd used for God knows what. Mom called Amanda, her voice surprisingly steady as she told her not to come back, to take the boys somewhere safe for the night. And I could hear Amanda crying on the other end, asking questions Mom couldn't answer. The police arrived within minutes, 2 cruisers and an unmarked car, and they sealed off the house like something from a TV show, yellow tape across the door, evidence bags for everything in that trunk. They found Dad in the workshop like I'd guessed, passed out next to a half-empty bottle of whiskey, sawdust in his hair, and they took him away in handcuffs while the neighbors watched from their windows, probably thinking this was about drunk driving or a domestic dispute, having no idea that they'd been living next to a monster for decades. Mom went to stay with her sister in Ohio, couldn't bear to sleep in that house again, and I drove back to my apartment in a daze, the radio playing holiday music that sounded like it was coming from another planet. The Brennan family finally got their answers, though I'm not sure if that made things better or worse, and Dad's trial starts next month, though his lawyer is already talking about diminished capacity, about how alcohol destroyed his judgment that night so long ago. Mom filed for divorce, sold the house to a young couple who didn't care about its history, just saw a good deal in a nice neighborhood, and that Lions flag probably still hangs from the porch, faded and forgotten, like nothing ever happened there at all. My brother Patrick kept asking if I really wanted to do this, right up until he walked through my front door carrying 2 pies his wife had made. 5 months earlier, I'd bought my first house, a colonial on a quiet street in Pennsylvania, and hosting Thanksgiving seemed like the perfect way to show everyone I'd finally gotten my life together. 31 and divorced, but at least I had granite countertops and a dining room that could fit the whole family if we squeezed. My youngest sister brought her 3 kids. My parents drove down from Scranton with enough wine to stock a restaurant, and by noon, my house was fuller than it had ever been. The kitchen windows fogging up from the heat of the oven, kids racing through hallways I'd just finished painting. Everyone kept complimenting the house, touching the crown molding, admiring the built-in bookshelves, and I walked around refilling drinks with this stupid grin on my face, finally feeling like the successful older brother instead of the one who'd moved back home after his marriage fell apart. The kids wanted to see the backyard, all 7 of them, ranging from my nephew who'd just started walking to my sister's oldest, who was almost 13. I remember unlocking the back door, the one off the kitchen that led to the deck, warning them about the steps being slippery from the morning frost that hadn't quite melted. They tumbled outside in a chaos of jackets and sneakers, and I turned back to check the turkey, calling over my shoulder for them to stay where I could see them through the window. My brother-in-law Carl was telling some story about his boss. Everyone gathered in the living room laughing, and I was focused on whether I'd remembered to put butter under the turkey skin, the sounds of family filling up every corner of my new house. When the kids came back inside maybe 20 minutes later, their cheeks red from the cold, tracking leaves across my clean floors, I didn't think to check if anyone had locked the door behind them. Dinner went better than I could have imagined, everyone finding their seats after some shuffling. The dining room table extended with both leaves, card tables pushed against the ends to make one long banquet setup. My dad carved the turkey while making the same jokes he'd been making since I was 5. My mom kept getting up to help, even though I told her to sit, and Patrick's wife Susan took photos of everything with her phone, saying she wanted to document my first hosting. The gravy was perfect. Nobody mentioned that the rolls were slightly burned on the bottom, and even my teenage niece, who usually ate nothing but chicken nuggets, tried the green bean casserole. We went around the table saying what we were thankful for, and when it got to me, I said something about family and new beginnings. But what I really meant was that I was thankful they'd all shown up, that they trusted me enough to break tradition and drive to my house instead of gathering at my parents' place like we'd done for 30 years. By the time we got to dessert, the sun had already set, which happens early in late November, and I'd turned on every light in the house to keep that warm feeling going. The kids were getting restless, sent back outside earlier with flashlights to burn off energy while the adults lingered over coffee and pie. My Aunt Helen was deep into her second glass of wine, telling embarrassing stories about my dad when they were kids, and I was in the kitchen cutting a third pumpkin pie when everything went dark. Not just the lights, but the hum of the refrigerator, the dishwasher I'd just started. Everything electrical just stopped. In the sudden quiet, we could hear the kids outside screaming, though it sounded more like excitement than fear, probably thinking the power outage was some kind of adventure. I had a flashlight in the kitchen drawer, one of those heavy metal ones I'd bought when I first moved in, thinking about being a responsible homeowner. The fireplace in the living room was still going, thank God, casting these orange shadows that danced across everyone's faces as they pulled out their phones for light. Except none of the phones were working right. The screens lighting up but showing no signal, no Wi-Fi, like we'd been cut off from everything beyond these walls. Patrick tried to make a joke about it being like the old days, but his voice had this edge to it, and Susan kept trying to call her mother, who was watching their baby. My dad went to check the circuit breaker in the basement while Carl and I gathered candles from around the house, those decorative ones I'd bought to make the place smell like vanilla and cinnamon. We were all trying to act normal, keep the mood light for the kids who'd come rushing back inside. But there was this weight in the air, this wrongness that made everyone speak in lower voices. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first, while carrying candles from the hallway closet back to the dining room. A shape moving past the window in the study, the room I'd turned into a home office, where nobody should have been. My first thought was that one of the kids had wandered in there, maybe looking for something to do without their tablets working. But all 7 of them were in the living room, huddled around the fireplace while my mom told them stories. I stood there in the doorway counting them again. Owen, Madison, all of them accounted for. And when I looked back toward the study, the door was slightly open, though I knew I'd closed it that morning after wrapping the last of the presents I'd hidden in there. The smart thing would have been to say something right then, get everyone together, but I didn't want to ruin everything. Didn't want to be the paranoid divorced guy who panics over shadows at his first family gathering. I walked down the hallway, each floorboard creaking under my weight, sounds I'd never noticed before when the house was full of electrical humming and family noise. The study door was definitely open now, maybe 6 inches, and through the gap I could see the curtains moving, even though the windows were closed. My desk lamp was on the floor, the ceramic base shattered into pieces that caught the dim light from the hallway, and the rolling chair was facing the wrong direction, turned toward the closet instead of the desk. But the worst part was the smell, this mixture of wet earth and something chemical, like fertilizer mixed with gasoline, completely different from the turkey and pie scents that filled the rest of the house. I pushed the door open wider, holding my flashlight like a weapon. And that's when I noticed the muddy footprints on my Persian rug, large boots that had walked from the window to the desk, then to the closet where the door stood partially open, darkness pooling inside like spilled ink. Patrick found me standing there staring at that closet door, and when he saw my face, he immediately grabbed my arm, pulling me backward into the hallway. He'd come looking because Dad couldn't find the circuit box in the basement, said it looked like someone had removed the panel cover and taken all the fuses, just pulled them right out and left empty holes. We both looked at each other, understanding passing between us without words. And then we heard Susan scream from the living room, not a startled yelp, but a real, throat-tearing sound that made us both run. She was standing by the fireplace pointing at the kitchen doorway, where a man none of us recognized stood perfectly still, wearing a thick canvas jacket and work boots caked with mud. He had this weathered face, deep lines around his mouth and eyes, gray stubble covering his jaw, and he was holding one of my kitchen knives, the big one I'd used to carve the turkey, just holding it down by his side like he'd been interrupted in the middle of something. Nobody moved for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. The kids pressed against my mother on the couch, my dad stepping slowly in front of them, while Carl grabbed a poker from the fireplace. The man didn't say anything, just stood there breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling under that stained jacket, and I could see now that his jeans were torn at the knee, dried blood visible on the fabric. His eyes kept moving from face to face, not wild or crazy, but calculating, like he was counting us, figuring out the odds. Patrick whispered for Susan to take the kids upstairs, but when she tried to move, the man shifted the knife to his other hand, a small gesture that froze everyone in place. The firelight made the blade gleam orange and red, and I noticed his knuckles were scraped raw, bits of skin hanging loose like he'd been punching something or someone before he got to my house. I tried to speak, to ask what he wanted, if he needed help. Anything to break this terrible silence, but my throat felt sealed shut. Then my nephew Owen, only 4 years old, started crying, that exhausted, scared wail that little kids do when they're beyond comfort, and it broke whatever spell was holding us. The man took a step forward and Carl swung the poker, not at him but at the wall, screaming for him to get back, get out, leave us alone. The sound was explosive in the quiet house, and suddenly everyone was moving. My sisters pulling their kids behind furniture, my Aunt Helen throwing her wine glass which shattered against the door frame, red wine splashing across the white paint like blood. The man stumbled backward, not from being hit but from the chaos, the knife clattering to the floor as he raised his hands to shield his face from the shower of glass and liquid. And that's when I saw the second one, a younger guy, maybe 20, standing at the top of the stairs just watching everything unfold with this blank expression. The younger one started down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and Patrick grabbed a brass candlestick from the mantel, shouting at him to stop. But he kept coming. My dad, 67 years old with a bad hip, charged at the older man who was still recovering from Helen's wine glass attack, tackling him into the wall, with a sound that shook picture frames off their hooks. They went down hard, the intruder's head hitting the hardwood with a crack that made everyone gasp, and Carl jumped on top, pinning his arms while my dad rolled away gasping. The younger one reached the bottom of the stairs and I moved without thinking. All that anger about the divorce, the loneliness, the pressure of this perfect Thanksgiving exploding out as I grabbed him by his flannel shirt and drove him backward into the grandfather clock my parents had given me as a housewarming gift. The glass face shattered, the pendulum swinging wildly as we crashed through it, and I could hear my mother screaming my name, my sisters crying, chaos erupting through my perfect new house. Patrick hit the younger one with the candlestick while I had him pinned against the broken clock once, twice until he slumped sideways, blood running from his ear. The older man was trying to get up, Carl struggling to hold him down, when we heard it clear and sharp through the broken silence, sirens approaching fast. My 13-year-old niece Madison was standing by the window holding her phone up, and she said in this tiny voice that she'd found a spot near the glass where she got 1 bar of signal, just enough to call 911 before it cut out again. The older intruder stopped struggling when he heard the sirens, just lay there on my floor staring at the ceiling, while the younger one moaned against the destroyed grandfather clock. We held them there, my family forming a circle around these strangers who'd invaded our Thanksgiving, until red and blue lights flooded through the windows and police officers came through both the front and back doors, weapons drawn, shouting for everyone to get down, to show their hands, turning our family gathering into a crime scene. Later, after the ambulances took both men away and the police finished taking our statements, we learned they were father and son, had been breaking into houses all over the county during family gatherings when they knew people would be distracted. They'd hit 3 other homes that same day, stealing cash, jewelry, whatever they could grab while families ate dinner in the next room. The police found a van parked 2 streets over with bags of stolen items, including things from my study that I hadn't even noticed were missing, my laptop, some silver cufflinks from my wedding that I'd kept despite everything, even the bottle of expensive bourbon I'd been saving for a special occasion. The cops said we were lucky, that usually these guys were in and out without anyone knowing. But something had gone wrong with their plan. Maybe they'd gotten greedy or lost track of time. And when the power went out, when we all started moving around with flashlights and candles, they'd gotten trapped in the house with us. We spent the rest of the night at Patrick's place, nobody wanting to stay in my house with the blood on the floors, the broken clock, the wine stains on the walls that looked like violence itself. The kids were remarkably okay, treating it like some wild adventure they'd survived, already making up stories about how brave they'd been. My dad's hip was bruised but not broken. Carl had cuts on his hands from the struggle, and I couldn't stop pacing, couldn't stop thinking about that unlocked back door, how easily everything had turned from celebration to nightmare. But here's the thing nobody talks about when something like this happens. We were closer after that night than we'd ever been before, bonded by something deeper than blood or tradition. We still do Thanksgiving together every year, but now we rotate houses and everyone triple checks the locks, and we laugh about things that aren't really funny, like how Aunt Helen's wine-throwing arm should be in the major leagues, or how Madison saved us all with 1 bar of cell signal. We never found out why the phone stopped working or who cut the power. The police said the intruders denied doing it, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is that we survived it together, that my first Thanksgiving in my new house became the story we'll tell forever. The year we fought back, the year we discovered what family really means when everything goes dark. Thanksgiving morning always meant the same thing in our house. Controlled chaos, the smell of butter melting in the oven, and me triple-checking that we had enough chairs around the dining table. My in-laws were flying in from Arizona that year, November 2016, and Greg left before sunrise to pick them up from Newark. Their flight was supposed to land at 7 in the morning, which meant he'd be back by 9:30, maybe 10 if traffic was bad. I remember standing in the doorway in my pajamas, watching his taillights disappear down our street in Trenton, New Jersey. He kissed my forehead, told me to start the turkey without him, and promised he'd call when he got his parents. That was the last normal moment I had, the last time everything made sense. I went back inside, put on coffee, and started prepping the sweet potatoes, completely unaware that my entire life was about to shatter into a million pieces I'd never be able to put back together. By 11 o'clock, I started getting annoyed. Greg hadn't called, and neither had his parents. I tried his cell 3 times and it went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual since he sometimes forgot to charge it overnight. But his mom, Barbara, she always had her phone on, always. When I called her and got her voicemail too, I figured maybe their flight was delayed and everyone was stuck in some dead zone at the airport. I texted Greg a few times, asking for updates, telling him the turkey was in, and asking if his dad still wanted the cranberry sauce with the orange zest or the regular kind. Stupid details that felt so important then. By noon, my sister Jenna came over to help with the cooking, and she could tell something was wrong. I kept checking my phone every 30 seconds, refreshing my messages, pacing between the kitchen and the living room window like I'd see his car pull up any second. Jenna tried to calm me down, said maybe they stopped for breakfast. Maybe there was an accident on the turnpike and traffic was backed up for miles. But I knew Greg. He would have found a way to call. He always did. Around 1 in the afternoon, I finally called the airline directly. The woman on the phone confirmed that Barbara and Richard Sutton had been on the flight, that it had landed on time at 7:04 that morning, and that they'd already picked up their luggage. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear her. If they'd landed, if they'd gotten their bags, then where were they? Where was Greg? I called Barbara's cell again, and when it went to voicemail for the 6th time, real panic set in. That cold, creeping feeling that starts in your chest and spreads through your whole body until you can't think straight. Jenna saw my face go white and took the phone from my hand. She's always been the calm one, the logical one. She suggested we call the hospitals just in case there'd been an accident and nobody had been able to reach me yet. We spent the next hour calling every emergency room between Trenton and Newark, describing Greg, giving them his information. Nothing. No John Does matching his description. No accidents reported involving his car. A dark blue Honda Accord with a dent in the back bumper from when he'd backed into our mailbox last spring. That's when Jenna said we should call the police. I didn't want to. It felt like an overreaction, like I was being paranoid, like any second he'd walk through the door with some crazy explanation, and we'd all laugh about how worried I'd been. But it was almost 3 o'clock by then, and 8 hours had passed since he'd left. 8 hours with zero contact. The officer who answered my call was polite, but didn't seem particularly concerned at first. Adults go missing all the time, he told me. Usually they turn up within 24 hours. He took down Greg's information, the make and model of his car, his license plate number. He asked if we'd been fighting, if there was any reason Greg might have wanted to take off for a while. I almost laughed at that. Greg wasn't the type to just disappear. We'd been married for 6 years, together for 9. He was a software engineer who color-coded his calendar and set reminders for everything. He didn't do spontaneous. The officer said he'd put out a bulletin for the car and told me to call back if I didn't hear anything by morning. Morning felt like a lifetime away. By 4 o'clock, Barbara and Richard still hadn't answered their phones, and I was losing my mind. Jenna suggested we drive to the airport ourselves, see if maybe they were still there, confused or waiting. It was a desperate idea, but I was desperate. We got in her car and drove to Newark. And the whole way there, I kept imagining scenarios. Maybe Greg's phone had died, and he'd borrowed someone else's but didn't know my number by heart. Maybe there'd been some miscommunication about which terminal. Maybe his parents had missed their flight after all, and the airline had given me wrong information. When we got there, we went straight to the baggage claim area for their airline. We asked everyone, security guards, airline staff, janitors. Nobody had seen Greg or his parents. We checked the parking garage, walking up and down the aisles looking for his car, and it wasn't there either. On the drive back home, neither of us said much. The sun was setting, the sky turning that dark orange color that usually made me feel peaceful. But that night, it just felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. When we pulled into my driveway and I saw the house with all the lights on and the half-prepared Thanksgiving dinner sitting on the counter, I finally broke down. Jenna held me in the passenger seat while I sobbed, my whole body shaking with the kind of fear I'd never felt before. The police showed up at my house around 8 that night. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, both wearing plain clothes and serious expressions that made my stomach twist into knots. They introduced themselves as Detective Mills and Detective Vasquez. They wanted to know everything, so I walked them through the entire day. Every detail I could remember. What time Greg left, what he was wearing, a gray Rutgers hoodie and jeans, what route he would have taken to the airport, whether he'd seemed upset or distracted that morning. He hadn't. He'd been completely normal, excited even, talking about how his dad would probably want to watch football after dinner. They asked about our relationship, our finances, whether Greg had any enemies or problems at work. The questions felt invasive, almost accusatory, like they were implying Greg had chosen to leave. I kept telling them he wouldn't do that. He wasn't that kind of person, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Detective Vasquez asked if I had a recent photo of Greg, and I pulled up one on my phone from 2 weeks earlier. The 2 of us at a friend's wedding, him in a navy suit with his arm around my waist, both of us smiling. She studied it for a long moment before asking if she could send it to herself. That's when it really hit me. They were looking for him. My husband was officially a missing person. The next morning, I woke up on the couch where I'd finally passed out around 3 in the morning, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. For about 5 seconds, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw Jenna asleep in the armchair across from me, still in her jacket, and reality came crashing back. My phone had 11 missed calls, 3 from Detective Mills, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize, and 6 from Greg's work. I called Mills back immediately, and what he told me made everything so much worse. They'd found Greg's car, It was at a gas station off Route 1 in New Brunswick, about 20 miles from our house and nowhere near the route to Newark Airport. The car was locked, keys still in the ignition, his wallet on the passenger seat with all his credit cards and $200 in cash still inside. His phone was there too, completely dead. The gas station owner had noticed the car in his lot around noon on Thanksgiving and figured someone would come back for it, but when it was still there Friday morning, he'd called it in. Mills said they were pulling the surveillance footage from the gas station and would be in touch. He told me to stay home, stay by my phone, like I could do anything else. Detective Mills called me back 3 hours later, and his voice sounded different, tighter, more urgent. They'd reviewed the footage from the gas station, and he needed me to come down to the station to look at it. Jenna drove me there, and the whole way I felt like I was going to throw up. When we got to the police station, they brought me into a small room with a computer monitor. Mills warned me that what I was about to see might be upsetting, but that they needed me to watch carefully, see if I recognized anyone. He pressed play. The footage was grainy, black and white, timestamp showing 6:42 in the morning on Thanksgiving. I watched Greg's car pull up to pump number 4. I watched him get out, scan his credit card, start pumping gas. He was on his phone, probably checking the time or his parents' flight status. Then, about 2 minutes in, a man approached him. The man was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, and he seemed to be asking Greg something, gesturing toward his own car parked at the pump behind Greg's. Greg put his phone in his pocket and walked over with the man, out of frame. That was it. 30 seconds later, the pump clicked off, but Greg never came back to hang it up. The nozzle just hung there, dripping onto the pavement. His car sat there, door still open for the rest of the footage. He never came back. I must have watched that footage 20 times, trying to see something, anything that would help. The man's face was completely obscured by the cap and the angle of the camera. You couldn't see a license plate on his car either, just that it was a light-colored sedan, maybe white or silver. Detective Vasquez asked if the man looked familiar, if Greg had mentioned meeting anyone that morning, if he'd seemed nervous about anything lately. I had nothing to give them. Greg hadn't mentioned anything unusual. He'd been working on a project at his office, complained about his boss being demanding, talked about maybe taking a vacation in the spring. Normal stuff, normal life. Mills told me they were treating this as an abduction, that they'd put out alerts to surrounding states, that they were checking traffic cameras along Route 1 to try to track where the sedan went after leaving the gas station. He used words like, escalate the investigation and all available resources, but I could barely process any of it. All I could see in my mind was Greg walking out of frame with that stranger, trustingly, helpfully, having no idea he'd never be seen again. The detective asked if I wanted victim services, someone to talk to, but I shook my head. I didn't want to talk. I wanted my husband back. The worst part, the thing that still haunts me, was calling Barbara and Richard. They'd been stranded at Newark Airport the entire time, confused and increasingly panicked when Greg never showed up. Airport security had eventually helped them file a report, and they'd gotten a hotel room near the airport, waiting for news. When I called and told Barbara that Greg was missing, that he'd apparently never even made it to the airport, her scream on the other end of the line was something I'll never forget. This raw animal sound of a mother realizing her son was gone. They took the first available flight back to Arizona the next day. Richard kept saying they never should have asked Greg to pick them up, that they should have just taken a cab, as if any of this was their fault. I tried to tell them it wasn't, but the words felt hollow. Everyone was drowning in guilt and questions. Why had Greg pulled off on Route 1? Why had he stopped at that specific gas station? Had the man been following him, or was it random? Had Greg recognized him? The police said most abductions are committed by someone the victim knows, but I couldn't think of a single person who'd want to hurt Greg. He was quiet, kind, kept to himself mostly. He had work friends, but nobody he was especially close to. No drama, no debts, no secret life that I knew about. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation went cold. The police tracked the sedan to a highway entrance but lost it in traffic. They interviewed everyone Greg knew, pulled his phone records, checked his email and bank accounts. Nothing pointed anywhere. No ransom calls came, no body was found. Tips came in from all over, people claiming they'd seen Greg in Florida, in Texas, in California. Every single one led nowhere. Detective Mills would call me with updates that weren't really updates, just ways of saying they still had nothing. The media picked up the story for a while. Local man vanishes on Thanksgiving morning, and family desperate for answers in mysterious disappearance. My face was on the news, pleading for information, offering a reward we couldn't really afford. Strangers sent messages of support and conspiracy theories in equal measure. Some said Greg had run away to start a new life. Others said it was human trafficking. A few even suggested I'd done something to him and staged the whole thing. The cruelty of people when they think they're being helpful is something I wasn't prepared for. Greg's job held his position open for 3 months before they had to officially let him go. I couldn't go back to my work at the dental office. Every time I tried, I'd have a panic attack in the parking lot. Jenna moved in with me for a while because I couldn't stand being alone in the house. Everything reminded me of him. His coffee mug in the cabinet, his shoes by the door, the dent in the couch where he always sat. It's been 9 years now. 9 years since that Thanksgiving morning, and I still don't have answers. The case is officially cold, though Mills retired and the new detective assigned to it calls me once a year on the anniversary, more out of obligation than hope. I've learned to live with the not knowing, though it never gets easier. People ask me all the time if I've moved on, if I've dated anyone, if I've considered having Greg declared legally dead so I can get closure. The truth is, I can't. Some part of me is still waiting for him to walk through that door with an explanation, no matter how impossible that seems. I've gone to therapy, joined support groups for families of missing persons, done everything people suggested. It helps, in small ways. I can function now. I went back to work eventually, moved to a different apartment because I couldn't stay in that house. But there's this permanent hole in my life, this question mark that will never be answered. Who was that man at the gas station? What did he want? Where did he take Greg? Is my husband even still alive, or did he die that morning and I've spent 9 years waiting for a ghost? The hardest thing is how ordinary it all was. Greg wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't in a dangerous place or taking risks. He was getting gas on his way to pick up his parents, being a good son, and someone took him, just like that, in broad daylight at a gas station off a major highway, and nobody saw anything useful. No witnesses came forward. The man in the baseball cap vanished like smoke. Sometimes I drive past that gas station, even though I know I shouldn't. It's still there, same pumps, same building. Pump number 4 is where I always stop when I need gas now. Some kind of twisted ritual I can't explain. I stand there and try to imagine what Greg was thinking in those last moments before he walked away. Did he sense danger? Did the man say something threatening? Or was Greg just being his usual helpful self, the kind of person who'd stop to help a stranger without a second thought? That's what kills me the most. Greg's kindness, the thing I loved about him, might be what got him taken. I want people reading this to understand something. This can happen to anyone. Your husband, your wife, your kid. One moment they're there, living their normal life, and the next they're gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. And you're left with nothing but questions and security footage that shows the exact moment your entire world ended. I still check my phone sometimes, half expecting to see a text from Greg apologizing for being late. I know that's insane, but hope doesn't follow logic. It just exists, stubborn and painful, even when it shouldn't. If anyone out there knows anything about what happened that morning, if you saw something, if you remember a light-colored sedan, or a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap near New Brunswick on Thanksgiving 2016, please come forward. Even now, after all this time, I just want to know what happened to my husband. I just want to bring him home. I hadn't been home for Thanksgiving in 6 years. Not since Dad passed away in that car accident on Interstate 95. the one that made the local news because of how sudden it was. Mom had been calling more frequently lately, her voice getting smaller each time, and my sister Emily kept sending these guilt-trip texts about how Mom was cooking for just herself now. I caved in October, booked the flight from Denver to Boston, and tried not to think too much about why I'd stayed away so long. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway. That white colonial with the green shutters on Birch Road, except the garden Mom used to obsess over had gone wild, roses climbing up the mailbox like they were trying to escape. Dinner started normal enough. Emily brought her husband Kevin and their twin boys, who immediately ran upstairs to what used to be my bedroom. Mom had made her usual spread: turkey that was slightly dry, stuffing with too much sage, the cranberry sauce from the can that Dad always insisted on. We were doing that awkward thing families do when they haven't been together in years, talking about nothing important, when Mom suddenly went quiet in the middle of describing her book club. She was looking at Emily with this strange expression, something between panic and warning, and then she said it. "Did you remember to bring those old photo albums from the room downstairs? I thought maybe the boys would like to see them." The temperature in that dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Emily's fork clattered against her plate. Kevin stopped chewing. Even the twins got quiet upstairs, like the whole house was holding its breath. "What room downstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, but I could hear how sharp it came out. Mom's face went pale, that papery white that made all her freckles stand out like spots on old parchment. Emily shot her this look, the kind of look that said, "Shut up, abort mission. We talked about this." "Oh, I just meant the basement," Mom stammered, reaching for her wine glass with a hand that trembled enough to make the liquid shimmer. "You know how I get confused sometimes. The basement storage area, that's all." But I'd lived in that house for 18 years before college, and my mother had never, not once, called the basement anything except the basement. She was sharp as a tack, did the newspaper crossword in pen every morning, never forgot a birthday or a doctor's appointment. Kevin cleared his throat and started talking loudly about some football game, and Emily jumped in with something about the twins' school play, and just like that, everyone was pretending that moment hadn't happened. I couldn't let it go. After dinner, while Emily and Kevin were getting the boys ready to leave, and Mom was in the kitchen wrapping leftovers in aluminum foil with that obsessive precision she'd always had, I went to the basement door. It was in the hallway near the kitchen, same place it had always been, that hollow wooden door with the glass knob that never quite caught properly. The hinges creaked when I opened it, and that smell hit me immediately. Not the usual basement smell of concrete and old cardboard boxes. This was different, sharper, like industrial cleaner trying to mask something organic underneath. The stairs were the same ones I'd walked down 1,000 times as a kid, going down to grab a can of tomato paste for Mom, or to find Christmas decorations in storage. But they felt steeper now, more threatening in the yellow light from the single bulb at the top. When I reached the bottom, I stood there on the cold concrete floor, looking around at the familiar landscape of my childhood's overflow. The furnace hummed in the corner where it always had. The shelves Dad built were still there, sagging under boxes labeled in Mom's neat handwriting. Christmas ornaments, Easter decorations, Emily's baby clothes. The old ping-pong table folded against the wall, its surface covered in dust thick enough to write in. Everything was exactly where I remembered it, except for one thing. On the far wall, past the water heater and the ancient freezer that hadn't worked since 2009, there was a door. A heavy wooden door with a deadbolt lock, painted the same dull gray as the concrete walls, like someone had tried to make it disappear. I walked toward it slowly, my sneakers making soft squeaking sounds on the floor, and I realized with absolute certainty that this door had never been here before. I would have remembered. I used to play down here on rainy days, used to help Dad organize his tools, used to hide behind those shelves when Emily and I played hide and seek. That wall had been blank, just concrete, and one of Dad's old Red Sox pennants hanging from a nail. The deadbolt was new, the metal still shiny, not like the rusty fixtures on everything else down here. But hanging on a small hook next to the fuse box, maybe 3 feet from the door, was a single key on a rubber keychain shaped like a lobster, the kind you get at tourist shops on the Cape. My hand was steady when I reached for it, which surprised me because inside my chest my heart was going like a jackhammer. I should have gone back upstairs, should have confronted Mom and Emily, demanded to know what they were hiding. But I didn't. I walked to that door, slid the key into the deadbolt, and heard the mechanism click open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet basement. The door swung inward when I pushed it, revealing darkness and a smell that made my throat close up. That chemical cleaner smell, but stronger now, mixed with something damp and rotten like old carpet that had gotten wet and never dried properly. I fumbled along the wall inside until I found a light switch, one of those old toggle switches that clicked loudly. A bare bulb flickered on, weaker than the one lighting the main basement, casting everything in sickly yellow shadows. The room was smaller than I expected, maybe 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls and floor just like the rest of the basement. But this wasn't storage. There was a metal frame bed pushed against one wall, just the frame with no mattress, and bolted to the floor near the foot of it were 2 heavy chains, the kind you might use to secure a boat or tow a truck. The ends had thick metal cuffs, hinged and lined with something that might have been rubber once but was now cracked and stained dark. On the opposite wall, someone had installed metal brackets, the kind used for shelving, but there were no shelves. Just the brackets positioned at different heights like measurement marks. A folding chair sat in the corner, and on it was a spiral notebook, the cover water-damaged and warped. My legs felt disconnected from my body as I walked to that chair, picked up the notebook with fingers that didn't seem like mine. The first few pages were grocery lists in Mom's handwriting, completely normal, milk and bread and chicken breasts. Then the list stopped, and there were dates. Just dates, written in Dad's blocky print starting in November 2006 and continuing for years. Next to each date was a number, ranging from 2 to 16. No context, no explanation, just date after date after date, the last entry from March 2014. I was at college in 2006, starting my freshman year at UMass Amherst, calling home every Sunday and talking about classes and roommates and nothing important. I flipped faster through the pages, and toward the back I found something that made the room tilt sideways. Polaroid photographs, maybe 20 of them, tucked between pages. They showed this room, but not empty like it was now. They showed people, different people sitting in that chair or standing against the wall with the brackets. Their faces were blurred out with black marker, thick scribbles that made them anonymous, but you could see they were conscious, staring at the camera, and every single one of them was holding a piece of paper with a date written on it. I dropped the notebook and heard something shift beneath the chair, a hollow sound like something sliding. When I bent down, barely able to breathe now, I saw that one of the concrete floor tiles was loose. I pried it up with my fingernails, breaking 2 of them, and underneath was a shallow space, maybe 4 inches deep. Inside were ID cards, driver's licenses, all from different states. Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. I counted 11 of them. Young people, early 20s mostly, men and women with hopeful faces staring out from the plastic cards. I recognized one immediately because her face had been everywhere in 2007, plastered on telephone poles and news broadcasts. Jennifer Huang, missing from a rest stop outside Albany in November 2006. I'd been 17 when that happened, and Mom had gotten so paranoid she wouldn't let me drive anywhere alone for months. Under the IDs was a folded piece of paper, official looking, with the letterhead of the Massachusetts State Police. It was a report, typed and formal, and my father's name was at the top. Detective Vincent Mercer, badge 2847. The report detailed an investigation into a suspected trafficking operation along Interstate 95. Young people disappearing from rest stops and gas stations between 2004 and 2009. There were names, dates, locations, and there, in the middle of the second page, was a paragraph that made my vision blur around the edges. Detective Mercer has been placed on administrative leave, pending internal investigation into evidence tampering and obstruction. Multiple witnesses have recanted statements after private meetings with Detective Mercer. Physical evidence from 3 separate cases has been reported missing from the evidence locker to which Detective Mercer had access. Investigation ongoing. The date on the report was January 2009. Dad retired in March 2009, took early retirement for health reasons, and we'd never questioned it because he'd seemed fine, just said he wanted to spend more time with family. The report was signed by someone named Captain Howard Brennan, and at the bottom, written in pen, was a handwritten note. "Vincent, we know. Leave now or we file charges. Your family doesn't need to know why." I don't know how long I sat on that concrete floor with those IDs spread around me like playing cards. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been an hour. My brain kept trying to make it make sense, kept trying to find some other explanation, but there wasn't one. My father had done this, had brought these people here, kept them in this room for days or weeks, and then what? The dates in the notebook stopped in 2014, a full year before his accident. I heard footsteps on the stairs and Mom's voice calling my name, getting closer, more urgent. When she appeared in the doorway, she stopped like she'd hit an invisible wall. Her face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds, landing on something that looked like defeat. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said quietly, and her voice had none of the tremor from dinner, just flat acceptance. Emily appeared behind her, and she wasn't surprised at all. They'd both known. They'd always known. "We found it 6 months after the funeral," Mom said, coming into the room slowly, like she was approaching a wounded animal. "Emily came to help me clean out his things from the garage, and we found the key in his toolbox with that police report folded inside. We came down here together and saw all of it." She gestured weakly at the chains, the brackets, the notebook I'd dropped on the floor. "We didn't know what to do. If we went to the police, his pension would be gone, the house would be taken, and those people, those families, they'd been through enough without dragging it all back up. He was already dead. We couldn't bring him to justice or bring those people back." Emily was crying silently, her arms wrapped around herself. "We cleaned it as best we could, sealed the door, tried to forget it existed. But Mom keeps slipping up, especially when she's nervous, mentions it without thinking. I gathered up all the IDs, the report, the notebook, every photograph, and put them in a plastic storage bin I found on one of the shelves. Mom and Emily watched me do it without saying a word. When I was done, I looked at them both and said the only thing I could think to say. "I'm taking these with me. I'm going to sit with this for a while and figure out what to do." Mom started to protest, her hand reaching out, but Emily stopped her with a look. The drive back to my hotel that night was a blur of streetlights and stop signs that I barely registered. I kept the bin in my hotel room, couldn't leave it in the car, couldn't let it out of my sight. For 2 weeks I didn't sleep much, just kept going through everything, researching each name on those IDs, finding their families online, seeing the missing persons pages that some of them still had up after all these years. Jennifer Huang's mother had died in 2012. Her father remarried and moved to California. Some of the others had families still searching, still posting anniversary appeals on social media. In the end, I did what I think my father's victims deserved. I called a lawyer first, explained the situation hypothetically, learned about statutes of limitations and evidence chains and what could actually be done this many years later. Then I made copies of everything, every document, every photo, every ID. I sent the copies anonymously to the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Division with a typed letter explaining where the evidence came from and providing the exact address of the house. I kept the originals locked in a safe deposit box in Denver, along with a letter to be opened if anything happens to me. The police showed up at Mom's house 3 weeks later. She called me crying, said they'd found the room, were tearing it apart, bringing in forensics teams. Emily stopped speaking to me entirely. The news coverage lasted about a month before it faded into the background noise of other tragedies. They confirmed identities on 6 of the 11 IDs through DNA evidence found in that room, gave those families some kind of closure even if it came with nightmares. Mom lost the pension, had to sell the house to pay for lawyers, moved into a small apartment in Worcester that I helped pay for, even though she barely speaks to me anymore. I haven't been back to Massachusetts since. I don't think I ever will. I'd been on the road for close to 6 hours that night, trying to make it to my sister's house in time for Thanksgiving the next morning. I had a small rental car, the kind that hums a little too loud at high speed, and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago. The highway was nearly empty, just stretches of blacktop broken by the occasional truck roaring past. Around midnight, I saw the blue glow of a rest stop sign and figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs and maybe splash some water on my face. The cold night air hit me the second I opened the door, sharp and almost metallic, like it carried a hint of something electrical. The place was dead quiet. Just a single pickup near the entrance and a white van parked diagonally across from me with its engine still running. The rest stoplights flickered every few seconds, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own across the asphalt. I remember thinking it was odd for anyone to leave a van idling that long, especially this late, but maybe the driver was asleep inside. I shrugged it off, locked my car, and started walking toward the restroom building. Halfway there, I noticed the vending machines by the wall were humming unevenly, that low mechanical buzz that almost sounds like breathing if you listen too long. I stretched, rubbed my neck, and checked my phone for signal. Barely one bar. That's when I heard something. It wasn't a full scream or a cry for help, more like the sound someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. It came from behind the tree line just past the rest stop fence. My first thought was that maybe someone's pet had run off, or a couple had pulled over to argue in private. But then she appeared. A woman, barefoot, hair tangled, wearing what looked like pajama pants and a gray hoodie that hung off one shoulder. She stumbled out from between the trees and froze when she saw me. Her voice was barely audible, hoarse and shaking. "Please, don't look at me. Don't draw attention." I just stood there, confused, my mind catching up to her words. Her eyes darted toward the white van, and for a split second I thought I saw movement inside, like a shadow shifting behind the tinted glass. She kept glancing toward the van, whispering for me to stay quiet. I wanted to ask if she was hurt, if someone was following her, but the way she looked, wide-eyed and trembling, made me realize she didn't want to be seen. The sound of the van's engine droned across the lot, steady and low. There was no one in the driver's seat. I took a step back toward my car, trying to process what I was looking at, when she suddenly crouched down behind one of the trash bins near the curb. "They'll see us," she said, barely moving her lips. That word, "they," froze in my head like a splinter. I turned my head just enough to glance back at the van again. The passenger side door cracked open with a metallic creak, slow and deliberate. A sliver of dim interior light spilled onto the pavement, and I caught a glimpse of someone inside. Maybe two silhouettes. They weren't talking. They weren't even moving much, just sitting there, facing my direction. My pulse kicked hard in my throat. I started walking, careful not to run, trying to act like nothing was wrong. Every step felt too loud against the concrete, echoing through that hollow space like footsteps in a church. Behind me, the van's engine revved. The sound was subtle, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck rise. I didn't dare look back until I was halfway to my car. The woman was still crouched, her hand over her mouth now. I unlocked my door, got in, and for a second just sat there, hand hovering over the ignition. That's when the van's sliding door slammed open, loud, metallic, like a gunshot in the still night. I didn't look. I didn't want to see what or who was getting out. I just floored it. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped out of that rest stop. My hands were gripping the wheels so tight my knuckles ached, and the only thing I could hear was the engine screaming and my own heartbeat. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the van's headlights blinked on, but they didn't follow me right away. They stayed there, idling in the same spot as I disappeared down the ramp back onto the highway. For a long stretch, I kept expecting them to appear behind me. those same two white beams in the distance. But the road stayed empty. For the next hour or so, I didn't slow down. My GPS told me there was a state police barracks about 20 miles ahead, but I didn't make it that far before calling 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking for the mile marker, the make of the van, and whether I could describe the woman. I told her everything: the bare feet, the way she looked terrified, the running engine, the people sitting still inside. She was quiet for a few seconds before saying they'd already received 2 similar calls that night from drivers along the same stretch of highway. One ended with a missing person report. By the time I pulled into a gas station near the next exit, I could barely hold the phone steady against my ear. The place was bright and noisy, a total contrast to the darkness I'd just left behind. A trooper arrived within minutes and asked me to show him exactly where the rest stop was. When I mentioned the woman, his expression changed. Not surprised, more like frustrated. He said they'd been searching that area for days. Apparently, several travelers had gone missing over the past month, all last seen between mile markers 214 and 238. They took my statement, and I waited around while more officers headed out to check the scene. About an hour later, one of them returned. He didn't say much, just that the van was gone when they arrived, and the woman hadn't been found. They did, however, find fresh tire tracks leading into a dirt trail behind the tree line, the kind that wouldn't show up on any map. The officer told me to keep my doors locked if I planned to continue driving that night, then handed me a card with a case number. I made it to my sister's place the next morning, way later than I'd planned, and I didn't tell her any of it. I didn't sleep that night, and I still haven't taken that route again. A few weeks later, I read an article about a human trafficking ring operating across multiple states, using vans and fake breakdowns to lure people at remote rest stops. It mentioned arrests had been made near that same highway. They didn't say anything about a barefoot woman. Sometimes when I stop at rest areas now, I still glance at the tree line, half expecting her to step out again, whispering for help. Thanksgiving week always made me restless. The highways stretched endlessly, quiet except for the hum of my old Ford Fusion and the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the dark. I'd left work late that night, hoping to beat the holiday rush by driving straight through to my parents' place in southern Indiana. Coffee thermos in the cup holder, talk radio low, and a half-eaten bag of pretzels on the passenger seat. It was the kind of solitude that usually cleared my head. I remember thinking the road felt heavier than usual, like it absorbed the sound instead of echoing it back. Around midnight, the world outside my windshield turned into a tunnel of black trees and yellow lines. Then I spotted the red blink of hazard lights ahead, faint, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. A silver sedan sat half on the shoulder, half on the lane, tilted just slightly like one tire had gone flat. My first thought was someone must have hit debris or maybe ran out of gas. I slowed instinctively, rolled my window down a crack and could see a figure standing beside the car, waving an arm stiffly in the glow of the hazard lights. It didn't feel staged at first, just someone stuck and freezing in the dark. I pulled over a few yards behind, kept my engine running, and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The air outside had that dry, sharp cold that bites the inside of your nose. The person near the car, a man, maybe mid-30s, called out something I couldn't make out over the hum of passing wind. He sounded strained, like his throat hurt. As I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight swept over the rear bumper. And that's when I saw it. Behind the car, a second silhouette moved, crouched low like they were checking the tire, but their position didn't make sense. The person wasn't fixing anything. They were waiting. My pulse jumped before I could rationalize it. I slowed my pace and angled the flashlight so it didn't reveal how tense I suddenly felt. The first man gave a half-hearted smile and said his battery died. His voice had this forced steadiness, like he'd rehearsed the line. The second figure didn't move, just shifted slightly. And I caught a dull glint near their hand. Maybe metal, maybe nothing. But it made my stomach twist. Every instinct screamed to back away calmly. But I knew if I turned my back too soon, I'd regret it. I forced a polite laugh and said I had jumper cables in the trunk, hoping to sound casual while I calculated my next move. The man nodded quickly, too quickly, and glanced toward the crouched figure as if waiting for a signal. My headlights cast long shadows over the road, and I realized how far we were from anything. No houses, no distant glow from gas stations, just black trees hemming us in. I popped the trunk halfway, pretending to dig around while keeping one eye on them. That's when the crouched person stood up. They were taller than I expected, wearing a hood pulled tight, and for a second, they froze in the glare, deciding what to do. Something about the stillness broke me out of whatever hesitation I had left. I slammed the trunk shut, jumped back into the driver's seat and hit the locks. The first guy shouted something, not words I recognized, more like a bark, and both of them started running toward the car. My tires spun on the shoulder gravel before catching the asphalt. The hazard lights shrank fast in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought that was it. But then, in the red glow of my taillights, I caught movement again. Their car's headlights flared to life. They weren't stranded at all. My chest felt like it was pulsing with the rhythm of the road as I pushed the accelerator harder than I ever had. The sedan's lights grew larger behind me, closing the distance. Every curve of the highway felt like a gamble. One wrong turn and I'd be in a ditch. I couldn't call anyone. My phone had no signal for miles. The only thing I could think to do was keep driving until I found a sign of life. Then, through the windshield, I spotted a green highway marker flashing by. Exit 114, 5 miles. I didn't even know what town it led to, but it was my only shot. The other car pulled closer, high beams flaring through my mirrors. They swerved left, then right, trying to line up beside me. I kept my steering wheel locked straight, praying the road wouldn't curve again. Finally, I saw a cluster of yellow streetlights ahead, the faint outline of a gas station and a diner. I cut across the lane, barely keeping control, and took the exit ramp at nearly 70. My car fishtailed but stayed upright. Behind me, the sedan missed the turn, flying past the exit and disappearing down the highway. I coasted into the gas station lot and parked beneath the brightest light I could find. For a minute, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. The gas station looked half abandoned, one of those places that stayed open 24 hours only on paper. A flickering sign buzzed overhead, and a single car was parked by the convenience store entrance, an old blue pickup, empty inside. I stepped out, scanning the road behind me. Nothing but the faint hum of engines somewhere far off. My heart was still hammering, but the silence felt heavier than the chase itself. I walked inside, trying to explain what happened to the sleepy cashier who looked barely out of high school. He blinked at me like he wasn't sure if I was serious until I pointed outside toward the highway. He picked up the phone right away and called the county sheriff. While we waited, I caught my reflection in the glass cooler door. I looked pale, older somehow, like the night had taken something from me. When the deputy arrived, I told him everything, every detail I could remember. The fake breakdown, the crouched figure, the moment their headlights came on. He nodded slowly, jotting things down on a small notepad, then told me something that made my stomach knot all over again. Apparently, there had been 3 similar reports that week. People pulled over to help stranded drivers along that same stretch of highway, and at least 1 car had been stolen. The deputy offered to follow me to the next town so I could rest at a motel. I agreed without thinking twice. The drive there felt longer than it should have. Every pair of headlights I saw in the rearview mirror made my pulse spike again. Even inside the motel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept the blinds half open, the TV volume low and the keys right by my hand. When I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamt of flashing hazard lights pulsing in the dark, always getting closer, never stopping. It's been a few years now, and I still avoid driving at night whenever I can. Every Thanksgiving since then, my family jokes about how I finally learned to slow down, but they don't know the reason why. Sometimes when I'm on an empty road and see lights in the distance, My foot hesitates before pressing the gas. I think about that man, the one who waved me down, and the figure behind his car waiting for me to stop. Maybe they moved on to another highway. Maybe they were caught. Maybe they're still out there waiting for someone else to be kind enough to pull over. I work as a mechanic in a small town about an hour outside Louisville, and that Thanksgiving was supposed to be one of the few calm days I'd get all year. My sister Lily had come down with her husband and their 2 boys, and my mom insisted we have dinner at my house since I'd just remodeled the kitchen. It was one of those cold, gray afternoons where the sky never really brightens, just sits heavy and pale above the rooftops. I remember thinking how nice it felt to finally have everyone together in one place, the sound of football in the background, the smell of stuffing, and Lily fussing about how I'd cut the bread too thick. Around 5, I started carving the turkey. It had been in the oven since noon, golden and perfect. The kitchen light flickered once, just a quick blink, but it was enough to make my mom joke about ghosts in the new wiring. I laughed it off and kept slicing. Then it flickered again, harder this time, the bulbs dimming until the room felt tinted blue for a second before returning to normal. My nephew Mason giggled and said the house looked like a horror movie. I didn't think much of it, but I remember glancing toward the window and noticing how still everything outside was, like the wind had stopped all at once. A minute later, the smell changed. At first it was subtle, just a hint of something acrid cutting through the usual warmth of roasted meat and butter. Then the smoke alarm chirped once and went silent again, even though the air was visibly hazing up. I turned to check the oven, and that's when I saw the smoke seeping out from the edges of the door, thick and gray like it had a mind of its own. Lily shouted, "Hey, something's burning!" I figured some grease had splashed over the pan, nothing serious, so I grabbed the mitts and pulled the handle. The second the oven door opened, a column of fire burst out like a living thing. It wasn't a normal flare-up. This was violent, explosive, the kind that roars with a sound you can feel in your chest. I stumbled backward, the mitts already smoking. My mom screamed for everyone to get out, and Mason started crying. I tried to reach the knob on the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Not even a click. I yanked it again, harder, but it was jammed tight like someone had glued it shut. Behind me, the fire spread along the wall, and I realized this wasn't just grease. Something had been waiting to ignite. I ran to the sink, filled a pot with water, and threw it at the base of the flames. It hissed but did almost nothing. The fire just climbed higher, feeding off something invisible. The air had a chemical tang now, sharp enough to sting my eyes and throat. Lily was trying to break a window with a chair, but the glass only cracked, refusing to give. My mom was on the phone with 911, shouting our address, but even her voice sounded small under the roar. The kitchen ceiling had started to blacken, flakes of soot floating down like burnt snow. I kept thinking, this can't be happening, not here, not in my house. Then I noticed the smell coming from behind the stove. It was different, almost sweet, like gasoline mixed with plastic. I leaned closer through the heat shimmer and saw the faint outline of something wet pooled along the baseboard. Someone had poured accelerant there, and it had soaked into the wood. My first thought was pure disbelief. Nobody but me had been home all morning. I remember locking the door after taking the trash out. The idea that someone had been inside while I was working in the garage made my chest tighten, in a way no smoke ever could. Lily finally smashed a side window using the fire poker. She cut her hand in the process, but we started passing people through. First the kids, then my mom. The air outside was freezing and looked gray from the smoke pouring out. I was the last one still in the kitchen, trying to grab the fire extinguisher from under the counter. When I pulled the pin and sprayed, the foam sputtered halfway, then died completely. The gauge was in the red. It was like everything that could fail that night had decided to do it at once. I dropped it, realizing I had about 30 seconds before the cabinets went up too. I ducked through the broken window and hit the cold ground hard. Behind me, the curtains caught, and the living room turned orange. My neighbors started running across the street with blankets and buckets. but the flames were already eating through the roof. I remember standing there, barefoot in the frost, watching years of my life turn into a single column of smoke. The fire truck sirens echoed somewhere far away, but it felt like the whole world had slowed down, stretching each sound into something distorted and unreal. By the time the firefighters arrived, half the house was gone. They kept shouting at me to move back, but I couldn't make my legs work. I just stood there staring at the spot behind the stove, where I knew that slick puddle had been. One of the officers later told me the accelerant had soaked deep enough to act like a hidden fuse. Whoever did it must have poured it hours before and waited for the right moment. The oven heat must have triggered it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who would do something like that, and why me? The next morning, I walked through what was left after the fire crews cleared the site. The air smelled like wet ash and melted metal. In the kitchen, the walls were gone, and you could see straight through the studs to what used to be the dining room. But the strangest part wasn't the damage. It was the thing they found behind the stove. An empty metal canister, scorched black, wedged tight between the pipes. The fire chief said it looked like it had been placed deliberately. It wasn't something that could have just rolled there on its own. The police asked if anyone had keys to my house, and I gave them the short list: Lily, my mom, and my ex-girlfriend Rachel. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in months, not since things ended badly over some money she'd borrowed and never paid back. When they called her, she swore she hadn't been near my place, and I wanted to believe her. But there was something about the way the canister was hidden, like the person knew the house well enough to plan it quietly, methodically. That thought stayed with me long after the investigation stalled. It's been 2 years now. The official report lists the cause as intentional arson by an unknown individual. Insurance helped me rebuild part of the house, but I sold it right after. I couldn't stay there. Not after knowing someone had walked through my kitchen, poured fuel behind my stove, and left me and my family to burn. Every Thanksgiving since then, I cook somewhere else, usually with friends. I don't even keep an oven at home anymore. Just a microwave, and a habit of checking every lock twice before I go to sleep.